On this episode of Back and Brew, I'm so excited to have Dr. John Schoeff, veteran, access surgeon, and also an entrepreneur that talks all things spine and wellness related to helping you live a longer life. This is Back and Brew. Man, thanks for coming on. It took a while to get it all coordinated. I know the end of the year is absolutely a disaster for everyone in spine. The way we met, though, obviously, you're an access surgeon. Kind of just give me a brief synopsis. A lot of people don't know what an access surgeon is relative to spine surgery or surgery in general. Kind of just walk through what your short, brief, what an access surgeon is.
Yeah, so I think in the world of spine, there are a number of ways to approach the spine for instrumented procedures, putting spacers in cages, what have you. We know all the ins and outs of that. And so one approach is to actually use the front portion of the spine, the anterior part of the spine, which serves some pretty significant advantages in terms of the corrective ability, the additive or sort of stretching out of the spine back to normal, so to speak. The challenge, obviously, in the lower spine, the lumbar spine, is there's these big doggone blood vessels, there's bowel, there's all kinds of stuff between the skin and the actual spine space. So an access surgeon, in my mind, is someone that is skilled, proficient, able to create sort of a channel, navigate all of those tissues, move the blood vessels off the spine, keep them safe, and then put everything back where you found it when you're done. It's very much, in my mind, as it's evolved, a very niche practice that I think I've had the opportunity to really hone my skills by making a decision. I made a decision 9 years ago now that all I was going to do was these procedures. So really dedicated myself to building the skill set.
Awesome. Absolutely. And again, that's how we met is I worked with a neurospine surgeon that you did access for, and inevitably we crossed paths. But I don't want to get too far into this episode of Back and Brew without going with the brew, even though technically I don't know if it's actually considered a brew that you brought on, but really interesting and actually more importantly ties into your story and something that you believe in even to a greater extent than most people or most guests we've had. So go ahead, tell me what you brought.
Yeah, so Ketone IQ, I wish I got some kind of kickback from them. I don't. I don't think it's a brew. It's more kind of like a chemical reaction. But to be specific, to be scientific, it's R13-butanediol. What does that mean? Well, when it's ingested into the body, it's converted into conventional ketone bodies by the liver. Ketones, and I'm hoping we're going to get into some of the weeds as we go along. Ketones are one of the two primary fuel sources in the human body. You got carbohydrates, sugar, glucose is the simplest version, and you've got ketone bodies. Both generate energy molecules from those substrates, right? We'll talk about advantages, disadvantages. I think we'll cover it. But this particular product has been proven very heavy in this cycling community as a stable, steady-state source of energy, which I would term non-insulinogenic. Alternatively, and you see this all the time with long-distance athletes, they're carrying their goo packs. Sometimes they're eating fruit on the run, so on and so forth. The dilemma with ingesting carbohydrates as a principal fuel substrate for prolonged activity, physical activity, is that invariably you're going to incite an insulin response, and that leads to these fluctuating glucose levels. This is the cleanest burning energy, if you will, that's out there. I use it for physical training, my weightlifting sessions, and it's an amazing substrate.
And so you gave me a warning. You're like, don't just like drink this straight.
Yeah.
Which you can. It's safe.
You definitely can. Ketone IQ produces nice little mini shots. If you're brave, unlike myself, I've done it a couple times under duress, and for me, it didn't really treat the palate as well as I'd like it to.
All right. Well, I'm gonna.
But
open
I
it up
would
and see.
encourage you to actually do a shot just to have the experience.
You know, like they always will say, like, if you have the right, what is it, like, who needs enemies when you have friends like these?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever any of my friends will be like, oh man, try this, there's always that one eyebrow up. I get a little bit of that tone going with this.
Yeah,
And
take a nice whiff. What would you what would you say?
Has a nice little, if you had like paint thinner or maybe, yeah, something that's a heavy chemical, like a paint thinner.
I mean, it's in the family of acetone, so it's going to have a nice little.
But it has a floral kick to it. It's a paint thinner with a floral kick.
This is like being at a winery. We're trying to a little like dark cherry notes.
I'll try it. I'll try it without first, just to give it. I'll give it a little.
Yeah, give it just a little swig. It's not the worst thing out there, but I wouldn't necessarily like sip on it with dinner.
No. It is possibly the worst thing out there. That is rough. Now that being said, it's meant to be mixed with stuff, right?
Correct. I mean that's how I use it. Yeah. I'll put it with you put it with a little Propel, a little Gatorade. Now I'm going to warn you. Here's the catch though. You put your high sugar Gatorade in your ketone IQ, right? And you get this blast of glucose. Now, the good thing is we've got Gatorade Zero. So no sugar included. This is, in effect,
my God, that's terrible.
Just going to improve the taste of the ketone bodies.
I am going to mix this. Yeah. Now, that being said, especially we're starting to see a big shift in general towards healthier lifestyles in general. Not just take a pill, take whatever the multivitamin is, but getting down to actually the science of how can I make my body perform at the best? Because frankly, success kind of requires that. Wouldn't you say, like, if your body operates better, you are probably going to put out a better product of being an access surgeon.
It's interesting, right?
How much of this do I put in real quick, by the way?
So, I mean, usually I do, if you look on the side, there's these lines.
Oh, yeah.
So each one's a shot, if you will. So I usually do just a shot at a time.
I did one shot.
Yeah, I think you're good.
Okay.
It's interesting, though, that you say that, because I would say that there's sort of two extremes in the world, say, for example, of success, right? We spend our days in the operating room, high stress, high cortisol environments. Typically, if you're really going hard, the likelihood that you have access to quality foods and nutrient sources, you're staying physically healthy, I think lessens over time. I mean, certainly I've gotten caught up in my own career of just going so hard that becomes extremely toxic. So I see there being the guys that just dig their heels in and say, nope, I'm going to make time to stay healthy, on top of my game, peak performance, which is sort of the route I like to think I've taken. But then you also have the people that just kind of go overboard in the other direction. It's the age-old obese 2-pack-a-day smoker cardiac surgeon, right? Where you're like, wow, so your lifestyle doesn't inspire me at all. I just hope you're a damn good surgeon, right? So I think anywhere when you look at the landscape, and first of all, you got to define success, right? Because monetary success, I think, is a very small fraction of the reality of success, and yet I think we hyper focus on that piece. So many people say success, and they think money. I think that's a minority of where success is ultimately derived. But it is fascinating to me to see the landscape of successful people in numerous different professions, and it kind of follows suit, right? You have the guy that's going out every night, 2 to 3 cocktails and red meat, throw in his little russet potato, right? That's the lifestyle. What does that look like? Well, typically obese, deconditioned, a lot of health risks that are evolving with time, right? But then I also see that group of people that are like, hey, my success in my business, my professional world, is derived from the discipline I maintain, which is what I think really differentiates those two populations. Both on paper can be successful, again, depending on how you define that.
Yeah, it's I think I think the reason that as a society, and I could be wrong, why we so quickly define success as something monetary is that the greatest stressor in general is money, right? And the funny thing is, like, people think once you get to a certain level monetarily that goes away, but the same stress, it just gets worse, right?
Only gets worse. That's if I have learned anything in life, you always, I don't know about you, but you get many times over in my adult life, I had a number in my head. If I hit this number, right, then I got breathing room. Then I got a little, lo and behold, you hit the number. And I joke around, with my wife, we are experts in extending our lifestyle creep beyond our earnings, right? And that's like the American dream, is staying just out in front of where you really actually exist financially. And so, whether it's, I once thought, generating $500,000 in cash, gross revenue in a year's time was going to be a home run. Not enough, not close to enough. And all you do is, right, you just level up. More stress, bigger buys. It just keeps going incrementally.
It really is. It's kind of a symptom of our consumerism, I guess. But to another, and again, on the other side of that is, as you're obviously entrepreneurial, and we'll get into some of your other things that you're doing. I noticed there's also a responsibility of being comfortable with that stress. When it comes down to being a true entrepreneur, we were talking about this before. Everyone sees you, 8, even 5 years down the line as a successful entrepreneur, but they didn't see the months you didn't get a check, the times you dipped into your savings to make payroll for everyone else around you.
Forget your savings, dipping into your third line of credit.
That's
when it gets fun. Like when you're really, like literally, right? Everybody in your life eats ahead of you. That is it, plain and simple. And that is a stress. If I could do away with one thing in my life, that would be, I think I would relinquish that. But there is some weird tie to it as well, right? You're still, I think by our nature, we're still kind of drawn to that. Like this, what I think about all the time is that ultra fine line between contentment and complacency, right? For me, at least, when I hear contentment, my mind starts to go towards complacency. Like you let off the gas, right? So there's that appeal of being happy with what you have. But then I think the way we're wired is that where's the challenge? Where's that next big move coming? That's the part I have yet to reconcile in my life.
You know what's weird? I was talking with someone else about this. You look back, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, and you'll look at it. Let's take a just random week time, like a week's time or like some event with your kid that you were doing. You look back at that and you remember, whether it's you going to a kid's baseball or soccer game, you remember the smell of the grass, you remember the early mornings, you remember how excited you were for them to be there. You remember how cute they look in their uniform. And you don't really remember the stress as much. Mm-hmm. You naturally remember that as a great time. If I look back in college, I was stressed outside my mind, right? I was fighting professional MMA, cutting weight, taking, 12 to 18 hours of credits. Most of them were sciences. And I was bartending and waiting tables all at the same time. Oh, and doing extracurriculars and doing some lab stuff. But I look back at it and I'm like, man, that was still great.
I look back at it and I'm like, even what you're describing, like, man, as bad as I thought I had it,
right?
it's a hell of a lot better than
But it's
where I
because you
am
got through
today.
it. Because you got through it, right?
So I'm convinced of this. You know, we remember the past much better than it was. We fear the future much more than we should, and we fail to live in the present almost uniformly. But I just think back. I've got young kids, right, and they get these breaks. You know, they get their holiday break, and then this break and that break. I'm like, when I was a kid, and this again, I mean, you can probably relate, something to do with how I was wired, right? I'm like, I just want to get through the breaks and go, 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 go. And now I look back, I'm like, man, how good did we have it? Like, even when you're getting crushed in college, you get like 4 months off.
Right?
I mean, it's like not even imagine that now today, like a week off. A week off is especially as an entrepreneur, right? The double-edged sword of time away, I don't know how you feel about it, is, okay, I'm spending money to do this, right? I'm going on vacation, for example, and I'm not bringing money in. That's a brutal reality that I think most of the world wouldn't even cross their mind, right? I mean, when I interview people now for various businesses that I own, I mean, first question, how much PTO? How much time off? I'm like, man, that is such a foreign concept, right? Because you got to think long and hard. Like, okay, it's all well and good. Okay, take 10 days off of work, but that's 10 days I'm burning through cash and not bringing any. That's a double whammy. I don't know.
But you have to speak that.
Perspective.
You have to speak that language, because your entire support system that's going to help grow that business, that's the only language they'll speak. So you have to speak that language. And if they didn't speak that language, if they thought the same way that you or I thought,
they probably wouldn't be interviewing.
Correct.
I know.
It's painful, man. Well, let's hop into, like, just kind of walk me through one real quickly, briefly, where you started, where you ever wanted to become an access surgeon, and kind of your military experience, and just walk me through that. I actually legitimately don't know that.
Yeah, so funny, I got asked this question literally earlier today. Did I always want to be a surgeon of some sort? And for a good part of my, at least adolescence, like, I got fascinated with human anatomy when I was in high school, and it never, that passion, that fascination never really left. Sometimes today, I'm very transparent about this. I feel like what I do for a living is just that, it's work. I hate the fact that I have lost some of that passion, that enjoyment. But like when the day slows, and for me, it's a very difficult, challenging surgery where in my mind, I'm not on the clock. I'm taking the time I need to get the job done, do it right. Those are the cases I actually enjoy the most, because you get back into the kind of why you did it in the first place. But fascinated by anatomy, and really felt very strongly about helping other people, making other people's lives better, standing in the gap, and so that took me through, I kind of went on the med school track through college, undergrad, straight into med school, 4 years of med school. And before I started med school, I made a deal with the devil. Actually turned out to be an amazing opportunity. I joined the United States Navy. So I had worked 3 jobs through college, like what you're describing, like going 1,000,000 miles an hour. Well, what I thought was 1,000,000 miles an hour. But I didn't want any more debt. It was super simple. And the truth of the matter is I missed the Air Force deadline. So that's why I wound up in the United States Navy. Fast forward like a couple months after I commissioned with the Navy, I go on a cruise to like the Bahamas, figure out that I get horribly seasick, like violently ill. And I'm thinking, this is not my best decision. But the Navy paid for my entire med school. Here's a funny thing too. They gave me a stipend, a living stipend, $1,100 a month. I look back at that, I'm like, $1,100 doesn't last like 6 minutes now, you know? Like, how is it possible that I didn't, again, it's perspective. I know I digress, but it's perspective, because I didn't feel stressed. I didn't feel like, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay my bills, right? And here we are, lifestyle creep, right? And now I'm worried about paying astronomical bills. But that was med school. And again, I went through med school with very kind of clear mindset around what my future would look like. My first love was plastics and aesthetic surgery. But the Navy at the time didn't really have much need for boob jobs. We 9/11 hits a year after I commissioned.
Changes the priorities a little bit.
Yeah, they were like, boob jobs, trauma surgeon in Afghanistan, we're going to go with. And unfortunately, they had the final say. So it's actually worked out amazingly well. But I was kind of directed into trauma surgery as a training route through the Navy. I was one of 2 people in my class to get what's called a deferment. So everybody else in my graduating class that had joined the Navy went straight into the Navy, various roles and responsibilities. I got another 5-year reprieve to do residency training. So I did a pretty intense surgical residency, finished that in 2009, and got kind of the deal of a lifetime, right? So I'm getting ready. At that point in time, I'm to report for active duty, okay? And they give me 2 choices. Well, excuse me, actually 3. One was a carrier. That was out because I get violently ill. I hadn't disclosed that to the Navy at that point, but I was like, yeah, that's not going to go well. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So go hang out behind the barriers, and moved to San Diego with a strict deployment protocol. So I'm in San Diego, ramping up for deployment. I'm going to deploy pretty much right out of the gate. I took San Diego.
Guantanamo Bay and throwing up over the edge of a vessel.
Yeah. I don't even think I would have been lucky enough to throw up over the edge.
You just would have never left the bathroom.
Yeah, you don't really hit the flight deck on a carrier. It's all in close quarters. It would have been bad. Turned out, I volunteered to basically serve in the Marine Corps, which was, you talk about radically life-changing. Like, I, to this day, have, 1, a level of patriotism I never thought possible. 2, just a profound respect for service members. It just, to see what the men and women that serve our country voluntarily, what they go through, and the risks they take. These are teenagers. These are 20-year-old kids. They're kids that will take a bullet for their comrade, basically. Next level. Just changed my life entirely. So very grateful for that. But it allowed, no one was going to compete with me to go to the desert. Everybody wanted the ship duties because they're more mellow, and you get to see the world. So no one contested it.
So you take mortar fire over sitting on a ship.
Well, I think the thing was, that's how bad I got seasick. The rockets weren't that often, so I'm like, yeah, I'll take that chance. But truly, it was the experience of a lifetime. For perspective, in surgical residency training, you have a minimum number of surgeries that you have to perform and document to graduate. Makes sense, right? You have to demonstrate some level of competency or core competency, right? So the summer of 2010, so my first deployment to Afghanistan was 2010. And it immediately followed, Barack Obama had sent 50,000 Marines to re-secure southern Afghanistan. Southern Afghanistan, by the way, it's wild, okay? Northern Afghanistan, is some of the most picturesque. Only way I know is I've seen pictures, but like these crystal clear lakes and greens and mountains. Southern Afghanistan is a stinking dust bowl, but it's not even. We called it moon dust because it's not like sand. It's this ultra fine stuff. Like to this day, all my gear that sits in my garage, if you bump into it, it's just a puff of stuff. But that moon dust just insinuates itself into everything. So Southern Afghanistan was by far and away the highest kinetic area in the entirety of the Afghanistan conflict. So the Marines came into the South to resecure, and all hell broke loose.
So you would see some stuff that was just of these kids that were just destroyed.
If I gave you stories, I mean, I could talk your ear off. It's taken this long for me to be able to kind of be semi-conversant about it, because that, so on the one hand, you have this, as a professional, as a surgeon, okay, like my surgeon brain says, there's no better thing in the world than to do a lot of surgery. And we're talking the most complex surgery known to mankind. I'm hopefully not being too crass here, but quite literally, we had anatomy books open at the bedside. We didn't have specialists like urologists or neurosurgeons. That was all us. So we're kind of like reading as we go.
Would you be pretty, it was kind of like, hey, stabilize them, get them okay, and get them shipped out of country then? Mm-hmm. So you would be the first line of remedy or the first line of like, just save these guys.
Yeah, if you looked at it, I mean, the way the military structures, combat medicine, the first line is what would be termed like care under fire. You want to meet some amazing human beings, meet a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine Corps unit, okay? They get called doc for a reason. Those people, they're embedded. They're literally firing bullets in one hand, putting an IV in the other. These guys are on a level that I had never experienced in the ability for someone with, let's be real, relatively minimal training and life experience to take on that task. That part of it in and of itself was mind-blowing. And so that was kind of like first line of care. Typically they get evac'd to what in theaters called a Role 2 facility, Role 2 being like a tent hospital or something. So I ran that element and did that entirely in my second tour. I did that for a short period of time, and then I moved to a Role 3, Role 3 being a building with walls. So it's as close as you're going to get to a hospital like you and I would think of it, right? So you have resources, you have blood banks, you have really plussed up sources. So that's usually kind of the staging point to get people out of the country. Then Germany was usually a next stop, and then they make it back to the States. That system in and of itself is astronomically effective, mind-blowing. What I'll tell you is this. It is amazing to see the impact of a small group of people that may not be the smartest, the brightest, the most skilled, that eat, sleep, live, work together for a prolonged period of time. It's pretty wild what people can do. I will never forget, I had this one corpsman, very simple guy. His job was to hang blood so when someone comes in, they're bleeding to death. His job was to start pumping blood back into the individual, right? You literally would have to call him off, like calling off the dogs, because all he's doing, he's just slamming his blood up there. He'd never say a word. He was so proficient at this one job. In the United States, I mean, in a trauma setting, you're lucky if you get someone that's even knows how to turn the machine on, right? So it's a perspective thing. But that experience was, and going back to just the case volume, we did almost 700 trauma cases in the summer of 2010.
Jeez.
Okay? So put that in perspective. that's the low end requirement to graduate from a surgical residency,
which is 5 years.
which is 5 years. So suffice it to say, there's a lot happening.
So do you remember like the first case? Because you'd mentioned that you had the idea that you're like, oh, this is going to be great. I want to do as much surgery as possible. Do you remember the first case you had there where you realized, and it was kind of a shock, like, this is where I'm at?
Yeah, so here's another kind of asterisk to the story, right? That I think is commonly misunderstood, is you have high kinetic zones. People are getting blown up left and right. People are actively engaged in war. And then you have a lot of dead zones. So the vast majority of us that would get deployed would go over there as surgeons. You go over there, sit in a tent. Here's perspective. You read your Kindle, right? I'll never forget the first iPad came out on my first tour, and one of the anesthesiologists that got it. Our minds were blown, like the color screen, touch screen. It was like, this is insane. So you read your Kindle for 9 months. Guys are doing 1, 2, 3 surgeries their entire deployment.
In the dead zone.
In the dead zones,
yeah,
which is the majority, right? And then here I'm in the not dead zone where we don't stop doing surgery. There was a team of 4 of us, and we rotated kind of primary, secondary. There wasn't a day we didn't do surgery, right? So they're extreme environments. For me, I remember a lot. Like it was yesterday. I can tell you the case that the last surgery I did in 2010 was probably one of the most extreme surgeries I've ever done, where a young man who's actually a British soldier got major vascular injuries to all 4 quadrants of his body, basically. So both subclavian arteries, both iliac arteries, so devastating trauma. And to see that kid actually not just survive, but thrive, it was shocking.
Would that be from like a blast, an explosion?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, so, yeah. The sad truth is, with the whole IEDs, you've heard of the improvised explosive devices. Usually, the guy that steps on it is just liquefied. Gone. It's the guy that's 2 people removed that gets maimed enough to survive. But my other critique on even the media following, because I remember coming back from the war. And they talk about KIAs, or those that are injured or wounded in action. The reality of being wounded in Afghanistan was you could be an inch from death and qualify as being wounded. Like the severity, you didn't have people coming in with scratches. You had people coming in missing 3 limbs of their body, but still having a pulse. So that reality. I said professionally, it's like a dream job. Personally, it shook me to my core. Became one of my close friends after coming back after our first tour was a 20-plus year trauma surgeon veteran, okay? New York City. This guy's seen a lot of you-know-what in his career. He couldn't get a sentence out without breaking down crying. He retired shortly after that tour. He followed me in Afghanistan. So this is the hardened, seasoned trauma surgeon. That's how, again, I could give you stories and examples, probably not worthwhile, but it just shook you to see, literally rows of body bags. That gets to you.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine. And like, honestly, thankfully, for the last how many generations in the U.S., we haven't ever had to.
Yep.
Right.
I know. Yeah. It's I'll tell you one thing. This is an aside, but you talk about like mandatory military service, and you look at the state, I'll wax philosophic. You look at the state of America today and the disengagement I see, especially with young people. They're so vocal about, the government this and everything bad. Let me tell you, pick up a rifle, go to war, and your perspective will change. It will change. The level of sacrifice you see people make every single day, and really the fundamental reason is because they love their country, So it's debatable about mandatory military service, but if I was going to support something, it changed my life. Again, I didn't go in patriotic at all. I thought I had gamed the system, really. I'm like, hey, you're going to pay for med school. We haven't been to war. That was the first Desert Storm was like all of a day, right? So me and my buddies like, we figured this one out. Haven't been to war in forever, so we're good there. Just going to cruise on autopilot, get school paid for, pay my dues, and break even, 9/11 hits. I can tell you right where I was. You can probably remember where you were. I had just gotten back from officer school. I remember picking up the phone, calling one of my buddies, my new Navy buddies, who's my best friend to this day. And we just both like, oh, crap. the landscape just changed.
Yeah. Plan changed.
Plan B. But for me, though, again, just the way I see life and the value of life and the value of our service members, like, people are like, oh, well, they signed up for it. Let me tell you, no one signs up to be pulling fingers out of another guy's behind that got blown up next to him, okay? No one signs up for that, right? No one signs up for piecemealing together your buddy that just blew up in front of you. No one does, right? It permanently changes everything about who you are. So I don't know, I'm beyond grateful that I got to serve.
And thank you for your service, by the way. I don't know if I've ever told you that. It is really interesting to see, like, I couldn't fathom that kind of stress. I remember I was talking to, I used to live in Austin, and I trained a lot with Tim Kennedy. He was like a big fighter in the UFC, one of the best 185-pounders. But I trained with him for about 2.5 years when I lived there. Awesome dude. Obviously, very decorated military experience. But I remember a bunch of us were sitting there after training one day. We were like, oh, man, talking about how scared we were for fights. Mm-hmm. And we're like, man, before I'd have an MMA fight, I'd be terrified. Mm-hmm. Like, that feeling never went away. I would always be scared. And he kind of wasn't saying anything. And I was like, Tim, did you ever feel that way? He goes, I miss that feeling. I don't have that. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, really? Like, why? He goes, I lost it in one day. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, like that kind of nervousness you get. He's like, I lost it because I had an event that was bigger. I'm like, oh, like, what do you mean? Obviously, I wasn't thinking. I kind of was like, oh, here it comes. He's like, I lost that fear when I was trapped under a Humvee that was flipped in Afghanistan under fire for 3 days. That was scary. After that, nothing else was scary.
Right.
And the funny thing is, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that come out of great military service, right? And I think that might be part of the natural fear and aversion to risk.
Right.
I think can be overcome by heavily traumatic experiences prior to that risk, right?
Yep.
Like you seeing what you saw and having someone else's life on the other line, dipping into a credit line, not as scary, right? Like not as scary.
Well, that's the thing you got to put in perspective. I mean, bear in mind, these young people are living in a reality. When you're at war, okay, there's a bullet coming down by your head any moment, unexpected, doesn't really matter. It just, the scope of your reality changes so profoundly. And you see movies that kind of allude to that.
Hurt Locker was a great one.
Hurt Locker's a great one. What's the Chris Kyle?
American Sniper. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and there's all this back and forth about was he legit, was he not? But the reality of all of it is just like you said, is that your perspective can change so dramatically that you lose the ability to function in a normal society, right? Because the only place you can exist is in this heightened, terrifying space that becomes normative. I just think the other thing I see is such a profound challenge. Two of my guys, scrub techs, committed suicide after coming back from their tours. And just asking someone to assimilate back to normal after your life has been, for an extended period of time, 9 months of your lifespan is spent in pure chaos with just absolute carnage. And they're like, the truth of the matter is, I can probably say this in this format, you do a PowerPoint and they pat you on your back. Hey, how do you feel about things? I'm good. Okay, good to go.
And they send you out to Trader Joe's. Like that's how it.
And let me tell you, when I went to Target for the first time, I lived in Southern California. Someone dropped something on the floor, and I hit the deck. I mean, you just have gotten so used to it, that world. And imagine, I wasn't getting shot at every day, right? So it changed my perspective. But it also, like you said, I mean, I think from a career trajectory and as a surgeon, the skills from there translated back to my sort of civilian life very well, and it really that prepared me mentally and professionally I felt like I had take on whatever I needed to take on. To your point, well, I've seen the worst of the worst. There's nothing you're really going to throw at me. In fact, part of the reason I got, I'll explain how I wound up in Denver briefly, but part of the reason I got out of trauma surgery is like I only knew one thing, which was the extreme of the extreme of the extreme, right? Like it's commonplace to have a 7.62 round blow off a torso. That's normal, right? Fortunately, in the U.S., that's not so normal, thankfully. So part of the reason I got out, I could never quite find a healthy balance. Trauma surgery in the U.S. is a lot of managing grandmas that fell down the stairs, unfortunately. So I never could quite get there, and I dealt with a lot of PTSD. So that drove me. All this comes full circle to say I moved to Denver in 2013. As you alluded to, my best friend, who you know quite well, Dr. Brent Kimball, we both showed up in Denver within like a month of each other. Similar stories where we kind of got plopped down at a hospital that turned out to be like a spine mecca. Just so happened we're young surgeons, we meet and we connected around my skill set in the exposure part of the procedures and his interest in doing these anterior procedures. And that kind of fortuitously turned into, it was like a right place, right time phenomenon that now is my entire, at least for my surgical practice, that's all I do. But I think when I came to Denver, I was a jack of all trades, right? And what became immediately clear is if I didn't figure out some unique skill or procedure, do something different. And when you talk about professional success, differentiation is the driver, right? Because hey, listen, if you and I have the same skill set, same tool bag, what is it that you do different than me that makes you valuable, right? So so many of us get conditioned to just kind of go with the flow, and we're not. I think that's the difference in our mindset is you're constantly looking for, okay, where can I tweak this? Where can I make this better? Where can I excel? And ultimately differentiate, right? Because otherwise you're just a name and a hat.
Yeah, I've heard it said, better's not better, difference better. Mm-hmm. And that is almost always is that the conversations you remember the most in any conference, the first ones you talk about aren't the best talks. It's not the best whatever. It's something that's different that you heard from anywhere else.
Yeah.
And you've really, and again, I say this from, I guess, third-party perspective, being in the Denver market. I mean, I came here in 2015 or 2016, and right away you were definitely different than the other access guys I had seen in other markets. That you weren't coming in, tired from the night before, where you were up at 2 a.m., doing a lap chole. You were just doing and committed to just doing access. Before it was really kind of the cool thing to do, or before it was even a known, established, I should say, pathway.
Well, for me, I think, to this day professionally, I think that's where I first became really comfortable with risk, because to hang your shingle in a fairly undefined or ill-defined space, the classic adage around anterior spine exposure has always been, well, anyone can do it. And I always say, well, anyone can do it. Very few can do it well, right? So it's a gray area. You have a lot of surgical disciplines, subspecialties that play in that area. And I still, to this day, I think the biggest risk I took was stopping emergency room call and saying, hey, I'm going to go all in to this niche that wasn't really a niche at all. Fast forward, 10 years, we have a presence at NASS, the largest spine organization in the world, right? We're now a recognized entity in terms of a practice discipline.
We being access
surgeons, correct. Understanding the value proposition. I mean, when we actually just 3 of us within that NASS subcommittee compiled our data, 1-year prospective data in terms of complications, and we reported a 0.03% incidence of major vascular injury, right? The literature, 2 to 20%, which is bizarre to begin with.
That's a huge range.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm not applauding any of this. It is a huge range, but in reality, some people will try to call that, there's parity, and no, that's just sloppy work, right? But the ability to concentrate, it should hold true, right? I mean, if all you do is a very narrow spectrum, you either develop a skill or you wash out. There's no real middle ground. So that was the risk I took. I found in my own practice, I've been solo practice since 2015, and that break point, that decision, I think was the first of many semi-calculated risks that I've taken. But I look back and I'm grateful that I did it. I mean, I think it's afforded an opportunity. And I feel bad for the guys they're up all night wearing 10 other hats, and the spine access piece of their practice is kind of a one-off type deal. These procedures, it's all well and good until someone gets into the cava. And the risk of, really the biggest thing, the risk of major vascular injury and hemorrhage is, albeit low statistically, it's the implications. You've been in those cases that people are having, going along, everything's smooth, and then all of a sudden it's gone to hell.
It's funny, we always tell our new reps, if you're in an anterior and you hear 6.0 proline hit the wall, just back up. It's probably
might
not
even
going
want to
great.
step out. That might be where you want to remove
that's not
your
a
name
that's not a
from
good
that.
one.
Yeah.
But no, I've been in. I've seen it. And it's so unpredictable too, which is crazy. That spine surgery in general. I was talking with this about one of my friends who's a spine surgeon as well. I'm like, your profession and the product that you produce is not solely based on you. The fact that you could have identical twins and have vastly different outcomes in the same procedure.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, there's no doubt. And I think, that's what I said. It is ultimately, it's been a blessing. I'm glad I made the decision I did, because I don't think these procedures they're not worth the dabbling approach. They're highly technical, highly demanding, and they go great right up until they don't. And it's that 1%, it's that less than 1% that can pose, a real challenge. So that, like I said, I think that was such a pivotal point for me, professionally, obviously, kind of gearing my practice or really honing in on this niche. I did a speaking engagement a few months back, and the person I was with was quite foul-mouthed, and one of her comments was, riches come from niches. And I held my tongue because I don't think it's pronounced niches, but you get the idea, right? Yeah. So finding a niche, finding a mechanism to differentiate. What do you do different? What do you do better than the next guy? Why on earth am I going to put my trust in you? Especially like if shift gears now, fast forward to the other half of my professional existence, which is, in the longevity space, right? Listen, people can go anywhere. When you get into what I would term more of the retail healthcare space, the differentiated, the concierge level care, all of a sudden now I better be differentiated. I better do something really doggone special, or I'm going to have an empty practice, right? So I think, I don't know, that's been that evolution.
So what was the big step for you between, what was that catalyst between access spine surgeon to I'm going to branch out and sleep even less and start Longevity Labs, which is describe what Longevity Labs is first, I guess.
So the Longevity Labs are longevity. My wife and I co-founded a longevity medicine practice here in Denver. Technically 2 years ago. We didn't really open our doors until about a year and a half ago. But it quite literally, I got to give all the credit to my wife. You would have laughed at some of the business names I came up with. But the Longevity Lab stuck because it's really the essence of what we do. Longevity is one of the top search words, Google search engines right now. Like you said, people are pursuing quality of life in addition to, so health span plus lifespan, right? Quality plus quantity. It's not just, there's no doubt 2 decades ago, we were living 2 decades less temporally, right? What does that tell you about modern medicine? Only that we can drag out the miserable even longer, right? So instead of just surviving, people have really shifted their focus to thriving and making those years quality. And so longevity within our practice is, I believe, a very high-level scientific approach to extending health span. The lab piece of it is really the origins of what we do. I'm a walking human experiment. I am my own lab rat, right? I won't ask you to do something I haven't done myself. I'm not going to talk to you about a technology, a treatment, a tool we might use or advocate for if I haven't developed the protocol based off my own body's response, right? So in the longevity space, for better or for worse, we're still tinkering. We're still figuring out what works, what doesn't work, right? I don't think we've really scratched the surface. I mean, we could go through I keep a list of 100 longevity agents on my desk, right? Of those 100 things, just like there's a million ways to skin a cat, there's probably only a couple that are really good, and then you got a whole lot bad. Same is true in the longevity space. Being able to center in or focus in on what are the things that move the needle is really where our obsession lies. And it is a passion project. I'll give you a little bit of background here, but that's evolved into probably one of the more fulfilling aspects of my professional career. Understanding that I spent 20 years becoming and practicing as a surgeon, and I still love to do that. The longevity piece, because it's a wide open space, it's like going back to school again. Someone asked me recently, they're like, what's the best textbook to read about longevity medicine, right? You have the Atiyahs, the Hubermans, and Mark Hyman's, all these guys out there. I said ChatGPT. I mean, quite literally, if you get into the weeds, it's just rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and you start chasing these holes down. Yes, some are blind ending, but some take you back to the very basics, the very essence of like biochemistry, right? Human metabolism, interaction between metabolic pathways. All of that is totally wide open. So it's like revisiting a whole part of my career that's just kind of sat on the back burner, you know?
It's really interesting to hear it especially even in the OR. Like we'll be in a case and during access. And I know that if I ask you anything about anything that is tied to longevity lab, or I won't even say longevity labs, to longevity as a human, I'm going to get pulled down this rabbit hole that ends with, it's going to always come back to, you have to have more mitochondria. You have to have more mitochondria. You got to generate more mitochondria.
But so here's the thing. I mean, if you want to go down that road, it's as complex as it is, it's actually also equally straightforward. My point in having that list of 100 top longevity supplements is to say all of this pales in comparison to two principal and really arguably three elements of longevity. When you're talking to an individual that's, seeking, a lot of people come to Longevity Lab, they meet with me because they're seeking answers, right? They're doing their homework. They listen to Atiyah. They do they're kind of like at-home longevity searches, right? So people come in, what do you think about metformin for longevity benefits? Those kinds of things. And the essence of everything really is simplified to three things, right? The three buckets, so to speak, that are proven in population studies over and over. The densest amount of scientific evidence for longevity, duration, and quality center on only three things that reduce all-cause mortality. So an independent reducer, all-cause mortality. You get this right, you have a lower chance of death from anything. You know how we talk about doing this reduces your risk of cardiovascular death. Doing this reduces your risk of dementia. I'm saying doing this reduces your risk of all of those and then some, right? And those three things, VO2 max, which is a reflection on cardiopulmonary performance, okay? Peak cardiopulmonary performance. Lean muscle, absolute mass on your body, lean muscle, and then insulin sensitivity. People leave off insulin sensitivity for whatever reason. If you want to open that can of worms, that's the best can of worms to open, is the impact of insulin resistance, the other side of the coin, on all-cause mortality, comorbidities, right? A leading cause of early onset dementia, insulin resistance, right? Leading cause of coronary disease, insulin resistance. I can tie it all back to insulin resistance.
They call it, I've heard it described before as diabetes as being a form of Alzheimer's, that there's
type 3. Yeah, you'll hear people talk about type 3 diabetes as what has been termed Alzheimer's, right? So early onset dementia, cognitive decline is absolutely correlated to higher levels of insulin resistance. And really, by the way, insulin resistance and chronic hyperglycemia are one and the same. It's the same conversation.
Yeah, you're not able to convert the glucose to...
Well, you're not able to metabolize glucose. But there are a couple key components, and this goes back to the longevity conversation, right? People come in and they want to know about this supplement and that supplement. The bottom line is this. Of those three things I just listed off, only one has direct impact on each of the others at an exponential level. So that's the one I'm going to go after preferentially, right? And that's skeletal muscle mass. So for every pound of skeletal muscle mass added to your frame, what are you doing? Metabolically, you're revving up the engine at baseline, okay? But think each one of those muscle cells, you said it earlier, that's millions of mitochondria per cell. Why do mitochondria matter? Mitochondrial health, why does it matter? That's pure and simple where metabolism is driven, right? So healthy metabolism at the mitochondrial level is imperative to long-term health, right? Mitochondria are more efficient in metabolizing glucose. Guess what? You don't have as much glucose in your bloodstream. When the system works properly, it all hinges on mitochondrial health. That's why a supplement like urolithin A, which supports healthy, what we call mitophagy, so turnover. When you get a bad fuel factory, we want to turn them off, get them out, right? That's what urolithin A predominantly supports. So those there, but bear in mind again, everything that if you sit down with me at Longevity Lab, all I'm going to talk to you about all day long are things that move the needle, and the thing that moves the needle most predictably is lean muscle.
So if someone comes in, if I come into Longevity Lab and I go, John, I want you to do whatever you got to do. I want to live longer and better. What is, like, walk me through the process of what happens day one, meeting one, when they come into Longevity Lab?
So one, I think back to the basics of medicine, you need to establish a very clear picture. What we do different at the Longevity Lab relative to any one of these millions of various practices out there, sometimes we get called a low T center. We're anything but a low T center. Do we do hormone health and optimization? Yes, right? Weight loss center, that's another big one. Oh, do you do medical weight loss? Well, people lose weight, but they really change body composition under our guidance. But everything to me has to be objective. So that's a very broad-based, high-level blood analysis tied to critical metrics, body composition analysis, what we term body metrics, right? We don't deal in things like BMI. BMI is such a horrible surrogate for a health predictor. We deal in waist to hip ratios, waist circumference as a predictor of morbidity. So we want to have the full picture and understanding of who the individual is and very strict objective criteria that we can tap into to really, it's about re-engaging healthy metabolism. That's really at the core of what's going to transform people's lives. Because bear in mind, I've yet to meet an American that didn't want to lose 5 pounds or something, right? But what they really want to do is lose fat mass. So re-engaging healthy cellular metabolism means, by definition, re-engaging the normal process of what's called lipolysis, using fat as a principal fuel source. Come full circle back to our lovely, tasty ketone IQ, right? We're using a principal steady-state fuel source in the form of ketone bodies, which is the net effect of metabolizing fat in the body. And it's the critical piece, the hallmark of using fat as a fuel source is non-insulinogenic. There is no insulin response when the body is relying on fuel from fat. Bear in mind, real quick, just to be clear, if you've ever gotten into a high grade state of ketosis, it's not very pleasant if you're an active individual.
Yeah, so we used to use that to cut weight for fighting, right?
Sure. Yep.
So it was really high fat, almost no, very, very low carb. And it was I'd go from, believe it or not, I used to fight at 170, and I would have to get down there, but I'd wake up at 185, and then I would have to make 171 by that night, and that was all dehydration. But leading up to that point, I walked around at 205, and so I'd have to I didn't even know what ketosis was at that point, right? I just knew my trainer was like, "You're going to eat only meat." I'm like, "Really? You're going to go carnivore?" And the vegetables I could have were broccoli, and the treat was sugar peas, snap peas. So you can have those.
Right.
And I had no idea what it was. But for the first 3 weeks, miserable. Headaches, horrible.
How did you feel? My curiosity is, how did you feel from just a global energy standpoint?
Pretty low.
Yeah.
Like
You
it
just
was,
feel
never,
gassed.
I got used to operating
Right.
at a threshold that was not great. Right.
Right.
And it's interesting because the benefit I had was that all my fights would be at sea level, or most of my fights would be at sea level, but I would be doing all this up at elevation. So inevitably, when I get down to the fight
Yeah.
time, I'd feel fine because I was right. But you're right. It's kind of, I felt very low energy, didn't feel great. And the other part of it is I couldn't maintain that.
Right.
Like it wasn't sustainable. And I look now with kids, there's no way you can sustain. Like it'd be tough to sustain.
Well, there's very few scenarios where, I mean, I understand that the role of high grade ketosis has a very limited breadth of benefit. In reality, it benefits those who are trying to get whole body inflammation down to a bare minimum. The best example I can give is people with unique cancers that tend to respond to a high-grade ketosis. So it actually can impact on recurrence rates and long-term health and survival. But bear in mind, it's at a cost. So when I talk about ketosis and the benefit of that, it really centers on a concept that we call metabolic flexibility. The ability to rapidly convert between fuel sources. That's the ideal scenario. That's the way we should function optimally. The best human body example I can give you of metabolic flexibility is insulin sensitivity. They're one and the same. Think of it that way. Right?
So when you say insulin sensitivity, just break it down to be like super, like I'm a rep. You got to explain to me in terms of.
No, I think that's what we're better designed to understand. So again, insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, two sides of the same coin, right? We're just saying one or the other. Let's talk insulin resistance, right? Insulin resistance is a lifestyle mediated phenomenon. Hate to be a bearer of bad news, okay? But the harsh reality is, even when we look and this is the reality of type 2 diabetes, it's largely a self-inflicted condition. It's not a disease. A disease suggests that you were afflicted by something. This is a lifestyle-driven condition. I know that's
this seems like sensitive. Body shaming. This seems like body shaming.
Exactly.
To you. That's what doing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. That's all I do. I shame people into success. So understanding insulin resistance is simply this. We live in a Western society with ultra-processed foods, high levels of refined sugar, and then layer in some, high fructose corn syrup, just all of these things that alter our natural metabolism. So instead of the body having to break down or digest, ultra-processed foods, the refined sugars, essentially almost go straight into the bloodstream. So what you have is these wide swings of glucose in the bloodstream, okay? Primitively, I would argue, the body's response to that is to secrete insulin. Why? Because we know chronically elevated levels of glucose is toxic, highly toxic. So when you talk about the inflammation associated with insulin resistance, it's not about the insulin, it's about the dysregulation of glucose. So when there's high levels of glucose in the bloodstream, the body needs to get it out of the bloodstream as quickly as possible because every one of those glucose molecules can potentially methylate normal tissues. Once you do that, the body's immune system sees it as a foreign body, right? So methylated tissues of any type, massive inflammatory response. So you get these spikes of glucose. Well, the body, again, the pancreas is designed to rapidly break that glucose, get it out of the bloodstream. Where does it go? It goes into predominantly muscle cells and liver cells, okay? So insulin receptors on a muscle cell, for example, once they get activated, they upregulate GLUT4 channels. So now the glucose is pumping into the cell, getting it out of the bloodstream. Here's the dilemma. Invariably, when you have these high spikes from rapidly available glucose, you get an even more aggressive insulin response. This is how this all starts out. Guess what happens? Your glucose levels plummet. So you hear people talk about, oh, I feel jittery. I feel like, a little bit diaphoretic, those kinds. It's not a good feeling, right? What do you do to resolve that feeling? Go eat some more refined sugar. right? Spike again, insulin spike greater. So you wind up in this highly fluctuating environment, and over time, insulin receptors get burned out. That's the best way I can describe it, okay? So now higher and higher insulin levels are required to achieve the same response. Your glucose levels are elevated above that, enter type 2 diabetes, right? So insulin resistance is a phenomenon that those high levels of glucose and that glucose dysregulation drives whole body inflammation, okay, among other things, right? Interestingly, here's some fun facts, right, about how insulin and glucose interact in the human body, okay? A lot of people with metabolic syndromes, aka insulin resistance, right, also have associated dyslipidemia. What is that? High cholesterol, high levels of triglycerides in the bloodstream, right? Where's that coming from? Is it coming from their high-fat diet? When you were in ketosis, did you have high cholesterol? But did you have high cholesterol? People in high-grade ketosis, do they have associated dyslipidemias? Actually, it's the exact opposite, okay? Ingested fats do not have a clear metabolic pathway to LDL, to hypertriglyceridemia. Guess what does? Sugar. Glucose and insulin. Glucose, when insulin stimulates hepatocytes, I could go through the whole metabolic pathway. Glucose, excess glucose, is converted to triglycerides first, stored in VLDL, and then converted to LDL. Glucose is the driver, right? I have so many clients come in, they're like, I've been on this low-fat diet to manage my cholesterol. That's not the problem, right? Fat's the greatest potentiator of euglycemia, stabilizes blood sugar. So it all comes back to this one fundamental issue. And if you look historically, when did we see rates of diabetes, cancer, obesity, coronary disease? Want me to keep going? It's a long list. When did we see that spike in the United States?
It had to be in like the 80s.
In the 80s.
Yeah.
What happened in the late 70s is the question, right? What preceded it?
Was that when they started doing the low fat
food pyramid?
Yeah, the food pyramid that had it's so funny too. I remember seeing that even as a kid in the 90s. I would see they had the food pyramid in elementary school where the base, what was it? Grains, cereal, everything. Like, hey, you want all that.
Carb load.
Yeah, carb load. And then at the top, there was a little bit of meat.
Yep.
A little bit of dairy.
Yep.
And then the very top was the sweets and sugars, not realizing the bottom
is the
was
driver.
all sugar.
It's the inciting source. And what's fascinating to me too, still today, when you go through the grocery store, in bold print, low fat. It's the exact opposite of how we should generally be approaching nutrition, right? And yet people still are focused on their dietary fats. Okay, so does that make sense? So the issue then becomes, well, they're really, you need a stabilizing force for glucose, right? And you need to ultimately reduce insulin or improve the effectiveness of insulin. But insulin and glucose are actually driving dyslipidemia. But here's another fun fact for our, the summer bods. Like this is January, right? So everybody's showing up. They want, summer bods are made in the wintertime, right? And I can't tell you how many clients I have come to my office that are singularly focused. We don't talk about weight loss. We talk about body composition change. But that's their focus. Hey, I want to lose the fat mass around my waistline, right? I used to think that when people give you the song and dance about, I'm doing everything right, doc, restricting my calories, I'm exercising, I go do my cardio, and I just can't lose the waistline, right? What's the deal? Here's the deal. It's called insulin resistance, okay? Another fun fact about insulin's role in the human body, right? Because think of insulin as a metabolic regulator, as a fuel regulator, okay? Again, we want to get rid of that glucose. So one way to get rid of it is use it as a fuel source. So if I'm also using fat as a fuel source, I'm not going to be able to get rid of the glucose quite so fast. Does that make sense?
So a high-fat, high-sugar diet is the worst that you could have.
Worst of the worst of the worst. Absolutely. But here's the thing. Insulin acts on fat cells, and it has one principal action, okay? The process of taking a stored triglyceride or fatty acid to getting it into the bloodstream, going to the liver, converting it to a ketone body, then getting energy from there, okay, is an 85 plus step process. Pretty long. Insulin shuts down step 2. You can't burn fat. You can't physically use fat. It is physiologically impossible in the human body to use fat as a fuel substrate if you have high levels of circulating insulin. That's the problem. Does that make sense?
Interesting. I've never heard it put that way. But so if you eat a high fat meal and then eat a big dessert, right? Tons of sugar going in. Mm-hmm. And you're expecting your body to be able to utilize that fat that you ate as fuel. The sugar doesn't block it, but it does block it.
Well, yeah, to the insulin response. For sure. I wouldn't necessarily frame it that way. I would frame it more as, listen, modern Americans have a lot of fuel on board. 18, 20, 50 pounds, right? I want to lose the weight, right? That waistline is a great fuel store, right? You could survive on it for a while, right? Stored fat is the best fuel source known to mankind. It's much slower, right? If you're running from a bear or running from a copse, it's not a great resource, okay? God designed us very, very principally to have a stable fuel source on board, rapidly available, jet fuel, so to speak, called glycogen. So we store glucose in muscle and liver. Our glycogen stores get burned up really freaking fast when we're going hard, okay? Again, primitively, you're running from a dinosaur, for example, all right? Glycogen stores give you jet fuel for about 15 to 17 minutes, okay? What happens then? What, you fall down and the dinosaur eats you? No, in fact, we have a backup mechanism to start chewing up muscle to deliver glucose to the bloodstream. So we have a fail-safe, okay? But that's all glucose mediated. Alternatively, we have this nice, steady-state, clean-burning fuel called fat. The problem with modern Western lifestyle-driven insulin resistance is that you have high levels of circulating insulin at all times. How can I tell you? Again, going back to what do you do when you come into the longevity lab, one of the principal metabolic tests that we do is a fasting insulin. How much insulin is your body, your pancreas producing when you have no reason to produce it, right? It should only come when you have a glucose spike. It is wild to see how high those levels of insulin are at rest. No stimulus, okay? But imagine, principally, that insulin's in your bloodstream. It's doing what it does. It's activating insulin receptors throughout the body. As far as your fat cells go, it says, you're not going anywhere. I'm not going to let you break down and deliver that clean fuel because I'm principally focused on glucose as a fuel source. Does that make sense? So this great debate, where I would be like, oh yeah, you're probably not doing something right, is actually probably false. Probably people in their mind. Now, here's the problem too, though. We do diet and exercise, right? Principally, that has been restrictive dieting in the form of calories. Really important, what we differentiate very early at the longevity lab is calories aren't the issue. It's content, not calories, content, right? So if I feed you an equal calorie meal that is negligible carbohydrates to moderate, 50 to 60% of the total is carbohydrates, right? One has a fat burning effect. As long as I don't turn on the insulin and rev up the insulin engine, I can actually still burn fat in the face of calories. How do I prove that? I check serum ketones. I can eat a 4,000 calorie total intake for a day and be producing a moderate level of ketones. Only way I can produce ketones is it's only one way: degradation of fat, stored fat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So again, you're taking, okay, yeah, these are complex metabolic processes, but dumb it down. If I got insulin in my bloodstream, I'm not burning fat. Physically impossible.
So I think for Americans, you have to, and me being one of those Americans, you have to dumb it down even more, I think. I think it has to be super simple, like actionable, right? Mm-hmm. If you're eating complex sugars, and fat, you will lose the benefit of the fat.
No, well, so hold on.
Or is that wrong?
Yeah, so we're kind of overlapping two phenomenon here because you have the issue of stored fat.
Yeah.
Okay, so adipocytes, fat cells, function really one purpose, which is to store fatty acids, okay, in the form of triglycerides. So if you can mobilize those fatty acids, those become a source of fuel for the body. You know, very different than ingested fats, right? So dietary fats.
Yeah, you're talking about adipose tissue as opposed to you eating
correct
ribeye.
Correct. So you can get energy from both sources, right? Like I said, most Americans are coming in saying, I want body composition change. So I want to be tapping into my long-acting fuel sources. My point is, if you have a diet that's high in ultra-processed foods, refined sugars, it's not happening. It is physiologically impossible. You do all you want, and you literally are climbing Mount Everest butt naked. You will not get to the top.
So
it can't happen.
So you can't outwork a bad diet.
Correct. That's the long and short. That, you know, there's some things that we got right in the past. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I can make a strong sell for that. But yes, you can't, and it's not as simple. It's funny. I gave a keynote speech. I was looking back like 2.5 years ago, and one of the key slides I really honed in on was weight loss. By the way, I was talking about weight loss, not body composition change, which is a disaster. Weight loss is simple, right? Simple math, calories in, calories out. It's not actually that simple. In fact, you can, like I said, ingest a high calorie diet, a calorie appropriate diet for size, age, sex, and avoid insulinogenic foods in that diet, and you have a radically different body composition, plain and simple, right? And we see that every day. So my priority, but here, this is the crux of this whole conversation, okay? Because we're talking about insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the devil, okay? Like I said, I can prove that out to you 1,000 different ways. And we can also talk about the most potent anti-insulin resistant peptide that the world has ever seen, called semaglutide.
I was about to ask you that about
tirzepatide. Absolutely,
yeah.
No.
I'm going to ask about that.
So and that is the function. Understanding the function. Ozempic is not a weight loss drug. It's an anti-insulin resistance peptide. It's naturally occurring. It's produced in the human body. We're concentrating that synthetically. And its most potent end effect is reversing insulin resistance. Like I said, you get rid of insulin resistance. I'll give you some stories about that if you want. But it's phenomenal to see those people that are laser focused on body composition change and just can't move the needle. Well, guess what? Their fasting insulin is 25, for example, okay? A normal threshold of 7, okay? So what I would term severely insulin resistant. You reverse that insulin resistance, the fat starts going away.
So would you, if I were to say, Dr. Schoeff, why don't I just take Ozempic?
Mm-hmm. Why not?
What are your thoughts?
What the heck, right? I'll tell you, if I can, 2.5 years ago, when I call it the Kardashian effect, right? You show your butt on an Instagram post and claim it's because of something, and then it takes off, right? It was really, that was the big driver for the massive uptrend in semaglutide or Ozempic, right? So why not just take it and go to town? Well, so that's what we did 2.5 years ago. We were bought in, as a practice, using very high dose GLPs. One fundamental downside comes back to a critical piece that we've kind of glossed over so far. The most critical downside to Ozempic, what is the net effect of Ozempic? One element of it is highly effective calorie restriction, okay? Calorie restriction, not necessarily bad. It's a means to an end, okay? I would also submit that this doesn't align with the literature, but I would also submit anecdotally in our practice experience, the GLP-1s, semaglutide, tirzepatide, even some future ones, have a direct antagonistic effect on insulin resistance, Okay, we haven't seen that borne out in large population data and the sustained trials that supported use for weight loss. The summary statement was the way in which semaglutide renders its anti-insulin resistant effects is through the weight loss, the physical mass lost. I strongly disagree with that. Strongly disagree. It is an anti-insulin resistant peptide, okay? We'll talk about that in a second. But here's the problem. Statistically, what goes along with weight loss, specifically related to GLPs?
Your metabolism, it's going to go down. And so
Okay.
you're going to eat less.
So here's the question. You're right, and there's something called the biggest loser phenomenon that we can talk about.
The show we know. Everyone knows that.
We know it well, but there was actually several scientific papers written based on following subjects in the biggest loser phenomenon, okay? Or the biggest loser show, right? We know what they do. It's extremely calorie restrictive, right? It's an environment that's not super hospitable, but people lose scale weight on the biggest loser. What happened to those people after the show? 90% of them regained the weight. Okay. What's interesting though is one of those papers looked specifically as a treatment endpoint of basal metabolic rate. We calculated before the show, after the show, and then follow on after the weight regain. And what you say is very true. They saw a substantial, about 700-800 calorie reduction in basal metabolic rate pre-post weight loss. Then the people gained all the weight back. And then some, right? BMR stayed the same.
So they couldn't fix their broken metabolism, basically.
Okay, but what are we saying? What is the real issue here? What happened along the way? Because it's the same thing we put at risk with GLPs. Any highly calorically restrictive diet exposes muscle to risk, okay? Risk of, so I talk in my practice, we talk about myoprotective strategies. Muscle protection is everything because losing weight, think about Survivor show, right? The problem with losing weight, scale weight, you want to know the most effective strategy to rapidly lose weight? Burn muscle. It weighs 2.5 times, it's 2.5 times more dense than fat. Does that make sense? So these people, and it's wild. I mean, you take very sophisticated, very intelligent individuals. They text me 3 to 5 times a day about their scale weight. What do I tell them? Throw the freaking scale out, okay? Some people, for healthy metabolism, I can see a radical shift in fat mass and body fat percentage by increasing your muscle mass. Now, on the scale, you may only see 5-pound difference, right, in absolute pounds. Why? Muscle, 2.5 times more dense than fat. If we add 3 to 5 pounds of muscle and burn 10 pounds of fat, that differential on the scale could be negligible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So we're talking about, so that's where one thing, again, 2.5 years ago, I was preaching weight loss, weight loss, weight loss. I think that takes us fundamentally down, and this is why at Longevity Lab, like I said, we do things completely different. Day one, I'm going to educate you about what is it that you're really after. You're after body composition change because that's a direct linear relationship to health span, extending quality and quantity of life, right? If we can reduce fat mass through reversal of insulin resistance, which is in fact what we're accomplishing, I know for a fact you will live longer, better, healthier life, right? Proven time and time again. But this goes back to that fundamental issue. I see there being 2 paths to fixing the root problem. Root problem, insulin resistance. Can we agree on that?
Yeah,
or if you'll give me that, okay? And maybe I haven't done enough.
We have enough type 2 diabetics out there at this point. I think we can kind of.
Yeah, well, we can infer, right? So insulin resistance is still the core problem. I recognized that in our practice 3 years ago. I still recognize it as a core problem today. The issue that has changed entirely for me in my own self-experimentation was what is the path to reversal of insulin resistance? Okay, traditionally we've said diet and exercise. That's always been the answer. And then we layered in GLPs. Statistically, in the United States, for individuals taking Ozempic greater than 6 months, there can be upwards of 40 to 50% loss of skeletal muscle. That's a disaster. So like you said, it's not the weight loss that's impacting on the basal metabolic rate. Your basal metabolic rate is largely derived from muscle mass. It's the loss of skeletal muscle. So what I firmly believe is in the next decade, sarcopenic obesity is going to be a major health issue in the United States. What is sarcopenic obesity? It's you crash and burn, you lose the weight with your Ozempic, but in fact, 50% of that weight was muscle. So like you said, now your metabolism has slowed substantially, right? And you get off the Ozempic, you go back to eating pizza and ice cream, right? Reinstate insulin resistance. But what you regain, what you replace that fat, or that muscle with, is fat.
Which can't burn muscle, which can't burn fat.
Correct. Right. Yeah. This is the age-old thing, right? Diet and exercise. So we say restrictive dieting, and what it's traditionally been is what? Cardio. Right? Yeah. Cardio burns calories. Muscle burns fat. Cardio does not burn fat, with limited exception. We can get into the weeds of that if you like. But so you have this pathway, okay? Yes, you will improve diet in a highly restrictive diet, reduce calories at all costs. You will target insulin resistance, no doubt. We have plenty of data to support that statement. However, what if we took a radically different approach? What if we target insulin resistance at its core by the one direct antagonist that the human body has to combat insulin resistance, which is lean muscle? Why is lean muscle a direct antagonist? If I add a pound of lean muscle, it will reduce your fasting insulin by definition, proven over and over. Why? Because I just added 10,000 insulin receptors, okay? Even though they're downregulated on the whole, I just added a fresh batch, okay? Potentiating the effects of insulin. I just added 1 million GLUT4 receptors. All of a sudden, I've got much more surface area to pull glucose out of the bloodstream. And fundamentally, what did we add? What we talked about, kind of the origin of this conversation around longevity, we added mitochondria. We added fuel factories that are going to churn through your glucose, right? So in this case, it becomes much, much, much less about calorie restriction. In fact, I don't really talk a lot about calorie restriction with my clients. How about instead of restricting, we have an additive phenomenon that by definition increases your metabolism. That's the other side of the coin, right? I can restrict you 300 to 500 calories is kind of general recommendation for weight loss range of about 1 to 2 pounds a week, okay? I can restrict you, or I can ramp your metabolism up. So instead of holding back that 500 calories, you just burn 500 more than what you did beforehand. Do you see what I'm saying? It's the same exact problem, looking from slightly different lenses and radically changing health span. Because this arguably impacts on health span. How? Loss of lean muscle. Restrict, 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 puts muscle at risk. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, so it's interesting because Longevity Lab is not necessarily just like, it's not a diet program in what people would traditionally think of as a diet program. It's more of a lifestyle modification.
Yep.
Now, how do you get people to work out?
Listen.
That's what I'm like.
Therein lies the challenge, right? So I would say this with the utmost respect. The beauty of being in the retail healthcare space, meaning the Longevity Lab, no secrets, it's a cash pay practice, concierge level care. And I tell my clients, why do it this way? Because in the modern world that we deal with healthcare and insurance, I get told how to care for people by who knows who, right? You know about this. We deal with it all the time in the OR.
Your peer-to-peers. What do the peer-to-peers sound like?
Says, I've never met this patient. I have no idea who they are, and I'm going to tell you what surgery you can offer them. And I may not pay you, by the way.
And who is that? Who's that peer, the other physician that you have to consult? Who are they?
Right,
who are
that's
they employed
the $1 million question. Right, yeah, and what are they incentivized by? So we've removed that barrier to quality health care. We're able to provide the level of care we want. But what's what's important about this reality is it also affords the opportunity for a two-way or bidirectional relationship. This, my practice in the longevity lab is entirely predicated on partnering with individuals on a lifelong journey. Like you said, there is a lifestyle component. There are any number of layers to that relationship. But the nice thing is, if we don't vibe, if we don't align in our principal goals, it's okay. I'm not the guy for you, right? So when you say that about, well, how do you get people to work out? Well, if you tell me day one, which I have plenty of potential clients tell me, I have no intention of lifting a weight the rest of my life, that might not be a good fit. We might butt heads too much to get anywhere. Does that make sense?
It's not a very profitable business, man. I'm just kidding, dude. But I totally get it, because it's interesting to see how fast people will rush to surgery. Yeah. Right? I mean, it's a quick fix. How many fat people get operated on?
Yep.
And in reality, again, this may be controversial to say, how many of them wouldn't be on the operating table if they lose 40 pounds?
Right. Well, when you talk, again, in the spine space, so bear in mind, I didn't really get into the weeds of this, where the origins of Longevity Lab, but one of the major elements was our prehabilitation program that I've run in my surgical practice for the last 6 years, right? For that express reason. We take people to the operating room, which is, by the way, like running them into a tree, major physiologic trauma in their absolute worst health condition possible, right? They're in the spine space. Many of them are immobile. They've gained weight, typically not good weight, not muscle. Their bone health may be an issue. Hormone health is typically dysregulated, especially related to central obesity. That whole phenomenon sets people up for failure. To me, I always say this, it's remarkable that patients do as well as they do under the circumstances with which we often are providing care. So 6 years ago, we started looking critically at elements of the prehab process, try to optimize people.
And so prehab, you're saying you get people ready for surgery, so that they have the best shot at the best outcome.
100%. But bear in mind, though, because we also have a lot of crash and burn people that come in 2 weeks before surgery and they're like, what can you do for me? My short answer is probably not a lot, right? So we've really targeted patients at that 6-month pre-op mark. And in the spine space, that's a lot of patients, because they get told they have to go through go to physical therapy for 6 months. They have all these check boxes to go through. Why not engage with those people same time they're getting sent to physical therapy? Why not look at optimizing their health and well-being, so that when surgery rolls around, like you said, instead of it being running you into a tree, it's kind of like a glancing blow and you're back in business, right? So we saw tremendous success with that. That was really one of the origins of Longevity Lab. That and sort of a selfish interest in exploring how I can incorporate, like I said, I'm going to do everything to myself first. How can I incorporate all these strategies, and what is the net effect? All of our proprietary protocols on Longevity Lab, their origins are, I did the experiment, and it worked.
I'm so glad you didn't become a plastic surgeon doing boobs. I'm just throwing that out there. That would have been really weird.
It would have been a different path, right?
Especially if you're your own lab rat, that would have been very interesting.
Yeah, but I'm committed. I would have had to go through it. No, but in fairness, I haven't had spine surgery either, so that's the one caveat.
That's fair. But to be fair, again, and this is coming from someone who sees you fairly often. Mm-hmm. I have never seen you so passionate about something outside of this. In like something that could actually change our society. Right. Because the biggest cost in our society is healthcare.
Yep. And where's that? What are the origins of that healthcare? I mean, again, for example, when you start to shift focus in life, I feel like the rose-colored glasses come off. For example, when I started getting deeper and deeper into these rabbit holes with longevity medicine, but also understanding that they all kept coming back to one thing, which was fix the central problem, insulin resistance, and you're ahead of the game, right? I travel a lot for work, as you know. And those rose-colored glasses come off. One thing I noticed, there are 3 to 5 diabetes treatment commercials per segment on NFL Sunday. Start paying attention, right? It's the Jardiance, it's all these, right? Turns out the diabetes, again, type 2 diabetes, big pharma play is $40 to $60 billion. There is a huge incentive in this country to not eradicate insulin resistance. No, in fact, insulin resistance is paying somebody's bills in a big way, right? And yet, like you said, healthcare costs are astronomical because we're running around like chickens with our head cut off, treating all this diffuse range of end products or byproducts of a central problem. Do you agree?
Yeah.
So we're treating obesity, obesity-related surgery. Now we have GLPs, which are incredibly powerful tools, but they're just that, they're tools. We're treating sleep apnea, heart disease, right? Leading cause of non-cancer death in the United States today, heart attack. I will tell you, outside of a genetic predisposition, the vast majority of coronary artery disease can be linked back to insulin resistance. Strong statement, right? But very true and validated repeatedly, okay? Look at all the money being poured into these industries that are linked back to a single problem. I just warn you that the general population, people that make a lot of decisions, including in the United States government, are disincentivized to address the central problem.
Absolutely.
Because they're winning. $60 billion, that's not bad. It's not a bad year, right?
Is HCA around if we don't have sick people?
Makes you wonder, right? Life gets really boring if everybody's healthy.
So I kind of wanted to pick your brain too on outside of Longevity Labs, which is incredible. We'll put up the Longevity Labs link on this post. Real quick, what is Longevity Labs? What is the website?
LongevityLabWellness.com.
LongevityLabWellness.com.
No S. So LongevityLabWellness.com. That's our same handle for social media. So Instagram, follow us at Longevity Lab Wellness. And then my handle's at John Schoeff. I'll warn you, my social media presence of late took a big dump towards the latter half of last year. So I'm coming back online. Really my priority in the social media space is to educate. It's to get this information that we're talking about here, and not to be insulting, but dumb it down, simplify it to the very basics. Instead of making it these lofty concepts, simplify it back to a couple key principles. And by the way, going to the kind of lab piece, the self-experimentation, what I've learned in my own journey, I've done everything. I've done highly calorically restrictive, okay? Even up to a year ago, I had done high-grade ketosis. Within the past 2 years, I had done a 4-month ketotic diet.
I remember when you were doing intermittent fasting and you looked terrible.
Yeah.
Looked like you were struggling when you'd roll in.
I was, my like I said, my energy was just in the dumps, right? Fast forward, true story. I mean, if you put it in perspective, and this is thanks to some of the technologies that we have. Again, it's a broad-based approach that we're taking, right? We're talking about hormone health and optimization. If your sex hormones, testosterone, men and women, and I would even argue today, from what we know about muscle health, testosterone is that much more important for women. Obviously, it has to be dosed and managed appropriately by a professional that's trained so you don't grow a beard, but it can be done well. And the most potent anabolic signal in the human body, right? So build muscle at all costs. Make it about that, like we've talked about, and that's the path forward to better metabolism. Most potent signal is testosterone. It's super simple, right? So ultra low dose or microdosed testosterone in women, optimized levels in men, we can create a healthier environment that is really tuned. So this is what I've done myself, tuned to build muscle. Fast forward, you're exactly right. Like a year ago, so my scale weight was 195 pounds. Okay.
And you're what, 6'2", 6'3"?
6'3", yeah. And my my skeletal muscle mass, okay, was about 93 pounds. Okay. True story. 6 months later, after really just making some significant changes in mostly diet modifications, right? Because that was when I was doing this high-grade ketosis. I added back carbohydrates. Carbohydrates aren't bad, okay? I want to be clear about that. It's ultra-processed foods, refined sugars. My skeletal muscle mass now is up to 119 pounds. So almost 30 pounds of skeletal muscle. My energy levels are through the roof. My ability to perform and maintain, right? Everything, every single metric you would follow, every single biomarker you would follow to define longevity has improved. So that is really the origin of like exploring that piece of the puzzle. Again, looking at it from a slightly different angle has changed. But the moral of the story is for all of us Americans out there that are calorie counting, that are losing our minds, right? Doing everything right. It's a whole lot more convenient to build up this metabolic engine that just runs 24/7 than it is to do all the crazy weighing food and measuring portions and all that. You can really shift the focus entirely, adhering to a couple key principles. Again, avoiding the refined sugars is probably one of the biggest ones. You can radically change body composition and metabolic performance in the same individual. And if you look at the scale weight, by the way, I said 195 pounds on the scale, 225 pounds today. People would say, isn't that, oh my gosh, you gained weight. Didn't you want to lose weight? I would argue that I'm dramatically healthier today as a result.
I 100% agree. I'm telling you again, it's interesting seeing or coming from a position where I did the heavy caloric restriction.
Right.
It was the injuries went through the roof once that happened, even, which was wild. Yeah, man, that's again. I think it's super interesting what you're doing. What is the first marker you do when you do a test? Because I always see you, and again, kind of just briefly walk through. You always see people with the little glucose monitors on their arm.
Mm-hmm.
Are those valuable? Should people use them?
Yeah, so glucometry or continuous glucometry, the patch, like you said, in essence what that's doing is continuously sampling the blood and giving you real-time glucose assessments. In the past, what we have to do, we had to prick your finger. That's freaking miserable, right? And you're only going to do it so much. So glucometry has changed the face of diabetes treatment, type 1 diabetes specifically. But there's been this huge trend in the health and longevity space to better evaluate the impact of foodstuffs on your metabolism. Foodstuffs and activity, I would say. I don't consider it a first-line therapy, okay? I think of glucometry as a pretty high-level pursuit that we use very strategically in our practice for two purposes. One, to support fasting strategies, and I can tell you about that. The long and short of it is, if intermittent fasting has any health benefits, there was a recent meta-analysis that was published. The only health benefits from intermittent fasting are related to calorie restriction. In other words, any which way you restrict calories, you will impact on insulin resistance. I'm not disagreeing with that statement, okay? Intermittent fasting is a means to an end. I see a lot of challenges there, though. But when you consider all these different variables that you have to bring into play, long-term, meaning 24 to 72 hours of strict water fasting is 10 times more potent, much higher total calorie restriction. I eat 4,500 calories a day. I don't eat for 2 days. I'm 9,000 in the hole, not freaking 300 and 300 and 300, right?
And your basal metabolic rate is still high.
Correct. So here's what I said. Like I said, we use the term Longevity Lab, is principal term is myoprotection, muscle protection. Strict water fasting or water only fasting is a myoprotective strategy. You don't subject muscle to risk if you're very strategic and you maintain data points through the duration of the fast. What do I mean? Well, that's where glucometry plays a role. I said earlier.
It's your ketosis. You want to make sure you stay.
Correct. So the natural trend should be in an individual in the near-term fast, short-term period, you're going to burn through your glycogen first. My goal in a fast is to deplete my glycogen stores. Why? Because I need to kick in my secondary fuel sources, which is fat. The problem, though, is as you're going through that fasted state, converting over to a starvation state, again, enter Biggest Loser, right, is a great example. What happens in starvation? The principal mechanism of starvation is gluconeogenesis,
which is burning muscle
to create glucose. So how does that glucometer give me a clue and a roadmap through the fast? I'll usually see glucose trend down, okay? If I see glucose spike back up, we're done with the fast. If that's 12 hours, if that's 72 hours, it doesn't really matter to me. But very clearly, if I see glucose spiking up, and we also trend serum ketone bodies as well, you see glucose spike up, ketones start to drop, the fast is done. Why? Your body is it's telling me I've switched into starvation mode. So it's all loss from there. Problem with the general population is these ideas that, oh, I need 24 hours fasting, which, by the way, most people aren't even fasting, but I need 24 hours to induce lipolysis. I need 72 hours. How do you know? So again, I come back to what do we do different at the Longevity Lab? Strictly objective. 2024, 2025, right? It's all about feelings. How do you feel? What do you identify with, right? I don't deal in feelings. I deal in facts. Being strictly objective. I mean, yes, I want to know how's your energy levels, how's your performance, so on and so forth, but I'm going to match that up with hard data points. So at the core, continuous glucometry, knowing where your glucose is every minute. Imagine if you just checked 3 times a day. You could miss a spike, or you could be on an upswing or downswing. You don't know. So it's imperative to have that data. The other piece of glucometry is actually through our nutritional program, which we have a completely separate in-house nutritional program. That interesting, I'm probably the only physician, I would bet, around town, if not in the country, that actually directs our nutritional program. And the critical importance of glucometry in developing healthy eating habits is knowing how foods affect you, right? So we determine 2 things. We determine optimal carb sources and ultimate, what we call the carb threshold. It varies patient to patient. It's heavily dependent on lean muscle, as you can imagine. But if I eat a certain quantity of carbohydrates and they're low glycemic index, so they're complex, you will see minimal, if any, glucose spike. The glucose spike is the problem, right? We've already said that. High glucose spike, higher insulin response, vicious cycle. If I can prevent those glucose spikes and actually moderate over time, extend out a lower peak glucose, does that make sense? I'm going to have dramatically less insulin response. Beauty is I'm also not going to crash and burn. I'm not going to have that drop off, okay? So that's where glucometry defines our fuel sources. Everybody is different, believe it or not. There are those, although in general, brown rice is just about as white rice. If you haven't heard that, it's true. Everybody tells me how rice is a major part of their diet, right? And that's how they're eating healthy with brown rice. Forget about it. The glycemic index of brown versus white rice is very similar. You're not doing yourself any favors. However, there is a cohort of individuals that seem to metabolize brown rice differently. So we always do a brown rice test. If you don't spike, good for you. Then brown rice is in the cards for you. But a lot of it's also about educating people, because people don't really believe it till they see it. Like I can tell them, yeah, brown rice is actually not good at all. It's a hyperglycemic food. And they're like, no, you don't understand. You know, I do it, I stay lean and all this stuff. I'm like, no, you don't understand, but here's a bowl of brown rice, and then now you will understand. Because you're going to see that spike 30, 40 points is problematic. So that's how glucometry plays a role. But I think there are all there's a lot of push. I love Levels, the program Levels online, which is a source of glucometry, but they're also a research-driven agency. So you're giving your data real time back to Levels. That's part of the agreement. So I love that for the healthy glucometry use, the non-diabetic glucometry use. Let's move the needle. Let's push forward with how do we consolidate all this information. The caution I give people is just wearing a glucometer, it's just a bunch of numbers, right? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to actually impact meaningful change? Having a physician-directed program to better understand what that data means, I think is imperative. But it is kind of, now you go to the gym, right? It's kind of the cool thing I see. I mean, I see everybody walking around.
The trends were laughable that you've had. Yeah, I mean, do you remember when people used to wear the elevation training masks? And they'd be wearing those things thinking that they're like, they're training at elevation. They don't. I know. You saw it on UFC.
I got to rewind. I got to rewind. Here's interestingly though, somewhat along those lines, right? One of the other major additives to our practice and programmatic approach to metabolic health has been metabolic testing. There were so many elements, I feel like, that we were leaving to chance along the way. And this has sort of been the evolution of our programmatic approach to longevity. More data, I think, is better. I guess I'm wired to value scientific evidence, that sort of by nature, by trade. But in so many instances, we're flying blind. Use the old aviation adage, you never have to take off, but you always have to land. So why fly blind? And yet, that's the vast majority of what we do with diets, with exercise trends, with advice on even in basal metabolic rate and calorie burn, everything, right, are assumptions based off of 30-year-old healthy subject data, right? How does that relate to the modern American? Here's something fascinating that I learned myself. So I talked about fasting strategies, and the metrics we use are glucose and ketone body production, okay? Suffice it to say, if I don't have any glucose on board, right, I'm not eating, not ingesting any, and I've gone through my glycogen stores, okay? I can prove that out to myself. I've got a stable glucose level. I've got an elevated ketone body production. That's where I'm getting my energy source from, okay? Now, with our fasting strategies, we intentionally incorporate metabolic activity, cardiometabolic activity, specifically low intensity. Have you heard like LISS is kind of a big one, low intensity, steady state cardio. That's one of the new trends, right? Zone 2 cardio. Well, what is zone 2 cardio? What does that look like? Zone 2 is a dual definition parameter. It is a cardiopulmonary performance metric associated with your aerobic anaerobic threshold. Does that make sense? Probably not. So where does my heart rate need to be as a cardiopulmonary stressor? Okay, so how active or how energized do I need to be to still walk the line of staying in aerobic metabolism? Aerobic metabolism equals fat metabolism. Anaerobic, only one source, glucose. So again, it's either coming from fuel sources, but I'm telling you I'm fasting, so I've depleted my fuel sources. So where's it coming from? Muscle. You get it? So I can very clearly define those performance curves real time. We're checking glucometry, looking for that glucose spike. Here's the thing. If I tell you, we pull out the book, say, Chandler, I want you to do some zone 2 cardio. The book is going to tell you that you need a pulse rate probably in the 130s, just eyeball test it, okay? 130s. Here's the problem. Americans, what I've come to realize, myself included, are profoundly glycolysis dependent, glucose dependent. Ultra-processed foods, refined sugars, even if you're trying to eat healthy. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So the challenge with traditional zone 2 cardio is that truly your aerobic anaerobic threshold? What if zone 2 by cardiovascular parameters is actually well into your anaerobic threshold? Now, it's different for everybody. Its performance metrics is how active you are from a cardiometabolic standpoint. But the trend I've seen in our practice which prompted me to bring on board, we've been using a product called Calibre, Calibre. It's a single user, multi-use metabolic cart. So I can now send you home with your smart device, and we can test your basal metabolic rate. We can determine your aerobic, anaerobic threshold, right? Something that used to require, you've seen the test where you're masked up, you got tubes coming out
looks
everywhere.
like you're running with a CPAP on, basically.
Correct. Yeah, I hope you don't trip, right? That's the gold standard. Calibre is within 1% of the gold standard. Fascinating technology. That's something we've incorporated. But why? Because here's the thing. This is what I noticed. So I go in, I do my zone 2 cardio, okay? Very clearly, I'm watching my pulse on my watch. I'm staying on it, okay? I do 65 minutes, okay? Pulse 133 to 138, really tight window. I'm really proud of myself, okay? Then I go check my glucometer. My glucose, which was steady state 80 all day, is now up to 130, okay? I'm like, okay, well, we'll check. Check ketones. My ketones have dropped in half, 2.3 to 0.9, more than in half, okay? So I'm like, okay, well, maybe just, adrenaline surge, maybe a little cortisol dump. Maybe it's just a odd phenomenon, right? Wait 2 hours. My glucose is still up. My ketone bodies are trending down further. Long and short of it is this. What I'm convinced of is being in my zone 2 cardiopulmonary performance range pushed well into the anaerobic threshold. So all of a sudden, I'm chasing my tail yet again, right? Because I'm inducing glycolysis. I'm inducing muscle burn when in my mind, I'm crushing life, right? So it goes back to the thing. I do believe more and more and more, you can technically be doing everything right and be getting it all wrong.
It's interesting too, because you see the marathon runners, everyone knows a runner, that you look at him and you're like, sure, by all explanations that are, of known given fact, you should be healthy. But you look at him and you're like, I don't want that body composition.
But let me challenge you here. In fact, when you look at biomarkers, there is still a trend within those individuals towards various metabolic conditions, right? So there you've put all your eggs in the cardiopulmonary basket, no doubt. I mean, if you're running marathons, your heart and lungs work really doggone good. And I would still make the argument you are less than optimized from a longevity perspective because what you've done is you've burned through muscle. Those guys also are extremely lean. And when I say lean, I'm not talking about body fat percentage. I'm talking about lack of skeletal muscle, balanced skeletal muscle for age, sex, weight. Now you see this trend a lot online in social media feeds about this hybrid athlete. And I think what is being reinforced more and more is the same thing I'm saying. Adding skeletal muscle. What does that mean for a marathon? That may be 5 to 8 pounds of skeletal muscle. But the impact of that from a longevity perspective, from a human metabolism, is so profound and is so profoundly beneficial. I also don't want to come across as being like a one-trick pony, like, oh, muscle's the answer for everything and muscle trumps everything else. No, absolutely not, right? It's an element of a broader...
Yeah, you see those bodybuilders that are just...
They're also the most unhealthy guys, for sure, right? So it's all relative. But when you simplify it down, like you said, I mean, okay, doc, tell me if I give you 100 things to do, a la Brian Johnson, the billionaire that does like 50 shots a day, 30 supplements, is able to maintain an erection while he sleeps for 6 hours. Total bizarre, right? Next level. Okay, if I give you 100 things today, I say, Chandler, I need you to take 12 supplements. You're going to do 4 injections. I need you to modify your diet. I want 2130 calories a day. I need all these things. The likelihood that you succeed drops precipitously towards 0. Is that fair? I have
Absolutely.
1 in a million clients that are able to perform in that range and they like that. Great, good for you. General population, no. However, if I say there are 3 things we got to get right, Everything we're going to do is about getting these 3 things right, okay? And above all else, build muscle. How do we do it? Optimize the environment, push towards anabolism, sex hormone optimization, thyroid hormone optimization, the breadth of cellular metabolic optimization to achieve an environment that is pro-muscle, okay? Next piece of the puzzle, okay, we want to talk nutrition 101. Here's the principle. Protein of the 3 macronutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrates, okay? Of those 3, protein is the non-negotiable. Meaning, I base all my programming from a nutritional standpoint on protein intake. I got to get you a gram per pound. That is the anabolic range for healthy muscle growth. Problem number 2, we'll come to the fitness things, problem number 3, but problem number 2 is people aren't taking in adequate protein, okay? 60 to 70% of their calories are carbohydrate-based, 15% usually bad fats, and then what's left over, okay? There's no way you have adequate building blocks on board to facilitate muscle growth. So you could do everything right, and the environment's tuned, but you have no building blocks, okay? So that becomes the non-negotiable. When I tell someone, if you're going to eat something, eat protein, plain and simple. That basic premise drives all my nutritional program. So when you talk about caloric ceilings, by the way, our approach to nutrition is as follows, pretty straightforward. Keto-friendly, meaning understand the importance and value of fats, ingested fats, as a fuel substrate and as a support element, right? Keto-friendly, carb-conscious or carb-aware. I need you to understand some basic things. Anything that says sugar, don't ingest it. Anything that involves high fructose corn syrup, definitely don't ingest it, right? And then the last piece of it is with a caloric ceiling. We know, listen, if you're taking in all these things we've talked about today, if you're taking in 15,000 calories a day, you will gain weight, okay? And probably not good weight. Now, it's hard to do that, but nevertheless, we still have to put some upper limit. Once we have that caloric ceiling, though, like I said, I take off the top that protein demand. Does that make sense? So the calories derived from a gram per pound of protein dictates your entire diet. Not that hard. Now, it's hard to ingest straight out of the gate for most people, most Americans, maybe not for you. Athletes are typically more aligned, but for most Americans, a gram per pound of protein is tough, especially out of the gate. Most Americans are eating on average 0.2 to 0.3 grams per pound, right?
Yeah.
What's it look like? Hey, listen, when you go to the restaurant, double up on meat. The waitresses always get driven nuts by me, but just ask for a second portion. Doesn't have to be rocket science. Just make it all about protein. And then the last piece of the puzzle, like you alluded to, is the physical aspects. It's the fitness, is the gym performance. How do we build muscle? You got the environment tuned, you got the building blocks in place. You still need the stimulus. Agreed?
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
an athlete. How do you build muscle? That's my question.
You have to do
you.
it. You have to.
What do you have to do is my question to you. What is the prescriptive direction for your gym, your workout?
Purely lifting. Like you have to lift.
Purely resistance. There is only
have to
one known mechanism to muscle growth, muscle hyperplasia. You can get hypertrophy, the pump, right? We all, you see the guys get their 30 curls in and they're pumped up and that just deflates like a balloon, right? Hyperplasia, muscle growth, adding pounds to the scale only comes from one mechanism, actually 2, but one recognized mechanism over centuries, which is resistance. More weight, but where do you need to train? This is the real question.
So,
what weight range, what rep range? You're an athlete. Where do you go with things? Is there, a little this, a little that, or is there really one defined mechanism to hyperplasia?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I would say it depends. So it depends if you're like not an athlete anymore, but when I was an athlete, I was very careful not to build muscle mass.
Okay.
So a lot of what we did was, it wasn't high weight, right? So it was a lot of body weight. It was a lot of other people's body, like doing a lot of high repetition, moderate weight.
But that's largely because scale weight
Was
in
a problem. You had to make
sport.
171, right?
Yeah.
Like
So
I had
it's
to make
very
171 or 185.
Right. And I would argue, again, I come back to the very basics of longevity. I would say that is not necessarily a longevity pursuit.
It's not.
Right?
It's not healthy, right?
So
like
you're
I didn't
managing
care.
this scale weight, which is what always has driven me nuts, you know?
Absolutely. So now post doing that, just looking at health, I lift heavier than I did then.
Yeah.
Right. So like I'll lift heavier. I'll take my time lifting. It won't be as high speed. Like
Right.
I won't get into that anaerobic state.
Right.
But yeah, that's pretty much it. Is just heavy. It's not even necessarily. I'm not saying heavyweight, right? Like
No, you need. So here's the thing. What does the science say?
you tell me.
Overwhelming data in support of muscle hyperplasia. What rep range and set range is that induced? Simple, 5x5. You need to be training at a weight.
Really? So they have like the actual prescriptive.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's 5x5 compound movement. So that's literally, I prescribe, if you will, to my clients. Okay. 2 compound movements a day, 3 days a week, 50 minutes, top end, 50 minutes. That is what's been proven over and over and over to induce muscle hyperplasia. Because again, you have to have the downtime to recover. You have to allow for recovery.
So how many days a week did you say you do that?
3 days a week.
3 days a week, 5 by
50
5
minutes tops. I don't care what else you do, but at the outset of that exercise program, 2 movements, compound movements, meaning like squats or bench press, where you're incorporating multiple large and small muscle groups. Okay, so compound movement, 5 sets, 5 reps. And what's really important about that, sets 4 and 5, reps 4 and 5 of sets 4 and 5 should be near failure to failure.
So you want to go, so if you were to put a percentage on that, you're looking at those 5 sets. So you would warm up like doing what? Push-ups, something like that?
Sure, yep.
And then you get into those 5
Your
reps.
working sets, yeah.
Your working sets, that's what I was asking. So your working sets are supposed
5
to
by
be
5 to failure. That is the only tried and true mechanism supported by very clear prospective scientific evidence.
I'm going to try
5 by 5.
I'll try it.
And the challenge is, right, so many people, most people, I would actually argue, except for like it's like the old school football guys, right? They get it. If I tell you, hey, just go do bro it out, meathead it out, heavy. There's that cohort of people that like flash back to their high school days and they just go rip through weight. Obviously doing it safe and controlled, but a couple key principles of this. One, and I tell people this, doing the apps, lifting solo, it's going to be virtually impossible for you to train at the appropriate rate. Everybody wants to switch the rules. No, I do best with volume training. Yes, from a hypertrophy standpoint, I am sure that's true.
That's exactly what I was talking
about.
about.
If you want me to do a freaking muscle biopsy on you, you want to build muscle, you want to add pounds to the scale weight in skeletal muscle, right? Body composition analysis. There really is only one mechanism to that end. And that's in that 5 by 5 rep range, overloading to failure. What general group struggle most with that? Women, right? Now, women, I tell more in the 8 to 10 rep range. And overload, not necessarily failure, but still the mechanism is same. You have to load, you have to induce micro trauma in order to grow. And you have to have the other 2 pieces, right? You have to have the environment dialed in, right? I have to have a strong anabolic signal circulating in my bloodstream called testosterone, right? I need the adequate building blocks. And what's fascinating too, by the way, when you talk about testosterone in women, the slightest amount still has that anabolic effect. It's an anabolic necessity. Sarcopenia, age-related sarcopenia in women, particularly postmenopausally, is probably one of the most devastating call it disease processes, if you will, that if left unthwarted, leads to multiple medical comorbidities. I am so convinced more than ever before that testosterone as a single agent in women is imperative. Perimenopausal to postmenopausal women, even if they're not a candidate for HRT, for hormone replacement therapy, which most are. That's a whole nother conversation. But still, even considering a very, very low dose, like I said, we have microdosing strategies where we get maximum anabolic benefit with little to no side effects. That's where you want to be. It's imperative that you have an anabolic signal in your bloodstream.
So and I've even thought it before, and maybe a lot of guys are like afraid to go get tested for testosterone, right? They're what their testosterone levels are. But if I start testosterone replacement therapy, will my natural testosterone ability or production decrease?
The answer is it depends. It depends on several things. One, the agent of choice. What are you optimizing testosterone with? Okay, I talked to you about a couple. I'd say top 3 options: the duration, and also the nature of the therapy. What are your end points? What are your end goals? How far are you pushing those levels, and for what purpose, and for what duration? Right. In general, exogenous testosterone support supplementation optimization, that comes in 2 forms. I would say pelleting, which are bioidentical hormones typically held in like a cholesterol capsule put in the subcutaneous tissue, so they leach out over time like a long-term depot form, and injection-based. In our practice, we predominantly use testosterone cypionate just because of the pharmacokinetics. Exogenous testosterone, by definition, will suppress natural testosterone production. No question, okay? There are several strategies that we can incorporate to kind of fool the testicles to continue to make their own testosterone. That is definitely an option. It's also an option to understand that, hey, this is a naturally occurring hormone in my body that my body itself, based on the levels we check at baseline, is failing to produce adequately. I'm going to add in and fill in that gap to normal or high normal levels. So people ask, well, am I on it for life? Potentially, yeah. Now, one thing that I don't use a lot of creams, a lot of topicals. The newer Testum is probably the best topical source of testosterone. In the past, they're greasy, they wipe off on your clothes. If you've got kids, it's usually a contraindication because you don't want your little daughter monkeying around with your testosterone. But it's a reasonable strategy. I find that it's a less effective strategy to get to an optimal level in a fixed time period. If I do injections with you, that's the most precise I can be in determining where your level's going to be tomorrow, right? Once your levels are there, understand with testosterone therapy specifically, I tell people, think about it like when you went to the high school gym and you went to that bank of lights, right? You got the gym's black. You go to the bank of lights, ka-chung, 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 right? And then the lights slowly come up to full. Same thing with testosterone, okay? Getting to an optimal blood level is time 0. Usually 6 to 8, up to 12 weeks beyond that is where you're going to see peak effects. So the longer it takes me to get to a steady state, the more protracted the onset of benefits is. Does that make sense?
So that's why it's better to just have the injection.
That's why I favor injections in general. There are a lot of circumstances, though. In particular, probably the most common circumstance is a young man who's of procreation age. Says, hey, I want to start a family. I've got this timeline, so on and so forth. Again, injection testosterone will suppress natural testosterone production. That's not the issue. It's spermatogenesis. Exogenous testosterone also suppresses sperm production. Now, does that render every male, this is really important, does that render every male who uses injection-based testosterone impotent? Absolutely not. I still have to counsel men about, if you're sexually active, this is not
It's not birth control.
It's not a free card, because I've had guys come back and they're like, Doc, you said I couldn't get my lady pregnant. I'm like, no, I didn't say that at all. I said it surpasses spermatogenesis. Okay. So that in general is probably the biggest cohort where I use caution around injection-based testosterone. If you tell me in the next 6 months, my goal is to start a family, that's probably not an option. Now, greater than that, though, there are recovery strategies that we incorporate all the time. The most potent recovery strategy, as well as improvement in likelihood of procreation. So if a couple's trying, they're not having success, I'm going to add enclomiphene, which is an oral agent. Okay, it's orally ingested. It kind of tricks the midbrain into thinking you're not producing enough testosterone. So it's actually naturally stimulating your own testosterone production. That is a very effective strategy too. I use it all the time in men who have reasonable intact production. So say a 50-year-old man comes to me, he says, I don't want needles. I don't want nothing of the sort. And his free testosterone is 10. Enclomiphene's a reasonable strategy. So people forget that it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. And we also use enclomiphene to recover testicular production, right? You hear about it in bodybuilders all the time. Same is true, though, for exogenous testosterone. So it's a very nuanced, that's the importance, I think, of having a physician-directed protocol where you understand all the nuances of what you're trying to achieve. But what we stress the most principally at Longevity Lab is the idea of we don't do TRT. We don't do HRT. We do hormone optimization therapy, testosterone optimization therapy. What does optimization mean to me? It's that optimal level, so you get peak benefit with little to no side effects. That's optimized, right? That number on paper is highly variable. It's all over the map. Where you are at achieve peak performance, our levels could be night and day difference, right? So it really goes back to the individual. Everything has to be objective-based, data-driven, and individualized. Because if I told you the cutoff, which you hear this all the time, total testosterone of 1,000, right? The lab says high normal's 900, 1,000. Oh my gosh, you're abnormal. You're high. I mean, for a lot of guys, that doesn't even scratch the surface. Some it does. Those are usually the guys that were living at 100, and now you've done a 10x multiple. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting because I've had, again, I'm 38, and in the last 5 years, I've had multiple friends that are trying to start a family.
Yeah.
And infertility is
Huge.
a real problem right now.
Huge.
And I don't know if it's people, getting, trying for families later, which could be part of it. But I had read this interesting article about how the Western body is just changing. Girls in the U.S. go through puberty earlier than anywhere else in the world.
Much earlier.
Our infertility rate is through the roof relative to other places in the world. It's really interesting in kind of looking into how much our food might affect that, how much our lifestyle affects that. What's your take on it?
I think you're spot on, and I would relate it to the kind of parallel phenomenon that we see over and over to a shocking degree of young men being in their 30s who are meeting criteria for hypogonadism. It's one and the same, okay? If your testicles aren't working, they're not working, okay? If they're not producing testosterone, they're not producing sperm. The net effect is infertility, male infertility, right? I'm not going to touch on the female infertility aspect of it, but I think it's a very telling narrative that supports what the observation is, that, hey, something's much different. What do I attribute to it? It's multifactorial, right? You got the plastics people. Oh my gosh, you know,
Microplastics.
Microplastics. That must be the problem. I think it's an element of it. Oh my gosh. Again, foodstuffs, the origin of dietary and nutritional support, right? I think that's a part of it. You're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to come back to the number one most potent suppressor of normal testicular function in males, visceral fat. What drives visceral fat? Insulin resistance, right? Visceral fat and insulin resistance are like partners in crime, okay? Visceral fat has an endocrine effect in preserving hyperglycemia, in effect, preserving itself at all costs, like biologically. Does that make sense? How do you preserve visceral fat? How do you grow visceral fat? High levels of insulin, high levels of glucose. I don't want to become this guy that's like, dude, your answer for everything is insulin resistance. But man, until proven otherwise, there's a lot of links back to this one single problem. So here's the challenge. And so we see this in males all the time, right? You have competing interests. That exact patient, example, true story. About a year and a half ago, I had young executive, very high level executive, 32 years old, morbidly obese. His BMI was 39. Like I said, I don't go, but if I told you waist to hip ratios, it wouldn't make any sense. Predominantly central obesity. So a high level of his visceral fat index was like 18, off the charts. Okay. His fat's central. 32-year-old, total testosterone of 130. Okay. That's like hypogonadism is defined in most lab criteria 280 or less. In effect, he's not producing testosterone. In effect, he's a eunuch, right? He's medically castrated. And what's the driver? It's the dense visceral adiposity. So the challenge, though, becomes with hypogonadal levels of testosterone, you're going to struggle at all costs to target that visceral adiposity because what do you need? You need more muscle. So hypogonadal individuals are not typically muscular. You don't have that signal, right? So how do you treat this guy? Because like I said, an enclomiphene-based strategy or an HCG-based strategy is not going to move the needle, right? A 2x, which is what we can see with enclomiphene, 2x times 100, you're still in the dumps. You're not moving the needle. So, you know, I would make the argument that exogenous testosterone is imperative to support that initial metabolic change. That's a prerequisite, right?
To get him over the hump to where he can even have skeletal muscle.
Correct. And arguably, and this is what I would tell, and this is what I did tell that individual, is probably least likely of any of my clients to necessarily need testosterone for lifetime, right? You change the body composition dramatically, you remove that biologic suppression of testicular function. So arguably, you should see a necessary decline of exogenous testosterone. But if you don't have that on board, what exactly do you want to do about it, right? I have women that have testosterone levels of 100. So you're it's not fighting an uphill battle, it's fighting a vertical shear with no hope. But going back to your point about infertility, guess what's not happening with this guy? He's not making babies. I mean, his testicles are non-functioning, right? So that is an issue that we're seeing more and more and more. I mean, that's usually that's historically what we've associated with someone in their 60s, right? 70s, later in life, having significant decline in testosterone production. These are guys in their 30s. So absolutely, are you going to see relative rates of infertility, male-related infertility be higher? Yeah. The problem, the driver is metabolic health. I would submit that so strongly, and the impact of reversing their metabolic dysfunction is profound. It's broad-reaching. But you can chase your tail all you want. And you know, arguably, again, you could use a high-dose enclomiphene plus HCG. You could come up with a regimen to increase sperm production and probably achieve procreation, but realizes the problem's central, and it's extremely sinister, and we're only going to see it more.
What are the for anyone that would be listening to this, what are some signifiers or some indicators that someone might have hypogonadism?
Well, here's the best thing. We'll go through kind of head to toe what specifically low testosterone would look like in a male. Obviously, they're non-specific findings, but it's also fascinating to me the number of men I meet with who I start out sort of in the subjective space. I want to get to know you. I want to understand who you are. Then we're going to match that up with all this blood work, right? All these numbers on a piece of paper. The number of men that are quote unquote crushing life, right? And then you juxtapose that with the reality that they are hypogonadal. You optimize their testosterone. All of a sudden, where they thought they were crushing life, they were getting crushed. So, point being, these aren't things just happen overnight, right? It's a slow progression. Yes, you have young kids. You're grinding. You're an entrepreneur. You have stress out your eyeballs. Are you going to notice?
Tired. No,
Correct.
You operate
Exactly.
Tired. Yeah.
So, I'm going to tell you, one of the first signs of hypogonadism, fatigue. Well, it's kind of hard to quantify because I'm like, I'm always fatigued. What does that actually mean, right? So a lot of non-specific thing. Brain fog is another one we refer to a lot, okay? That may be impact on short-term memory typically. It might also be clarity and judgment. That's a fascinating piece of the puzzle when it comes to testosterone optimization, that one of the things almost every male keys in on is clear, decisive control in a healthy way. Bear in mind, we're not doing toxic masculinity today, folks. That's not something we touch. Believe it or not, there are males out there that can actually be assertive and strong and not be toxic.
That sounds very patriarchal. I'm just saying.
I know. I wanted to be, I came in today and I was like, I'm not going to get controversial here.
Isn't it crazy though? You look at a guy like RFK, regardless of what people think about him, and you're like, all right, I don't care what politically people think about him have any decisions to do with healthcare decisions made in our country. If I'm 70 and I look like that,
it begs the question, right?
Yeah. Compared to what he replaced, right. I'm like,
well, that's, like I said, the biggest picture piece of all this, and something that I've really tried to focus on myself. Again, Longevity Labs is selfish ambition, plain and simple. I get to tinker with my own physiology to the nth degree, see what works, see what doesn't, push the envelope. But fundamentally, it doesn't work any other way. If you're coming to me for advice on longevity and I'm 50 pounds overweight, I smoke, and there's no hope of me living past the age of 50, it's going to be a harder sell. Like if I'm not putting myself in a position to be aspirational, to inspire, and if I'm not living everything out myself, why the heck would you follow any of my guidance, right? And yet that's how we do it all the time. But the issue, I think, in all regards to this hormone health piece is really about, again, driving or directing in a very controlled fashion, leveraging science to create an optimal environment. We can, one of the biggest groups of critics that I have healthy debates back and forth is in the movement science space, the performance guys, the personal trainers, right? Like, we're doing it all natural. Listen, if your guy has total testosterone production in the 200 to 300 range, that's actually unnatural, right? Like, so leaving that off the table, you're not really helping anybody's cause. In fact, like you said, you're potentially creating an increased risk of injury because, again, the body is not conditioned. It's not fully regulated to do what it needs to do, right? You had another question. I totally spaced.
No, you answered them. Yeah, that's it is interesting. You always got to wonder in the back of your mind too. For anyone who hasn't done any of that, it goes back and you're like, even if you are that guy that was crushing it per the standards of whatever anyone else thinks, like what if they did just want that extra edge?
Right. Well, like I said, to me, that's the basis of optimization. It's we take it a step further at our practice and we talk about performance optimization for select clients. To me, performance optimization is pushing the envelope of it's really, if you got good, better, best, phenomenal, that's where performance optimization lies. It understands, though, that, hey, we're going to push past the physiologic limits and really extract the greatest value from each of your human cells. And we accept that there may be side effects that are manageable. I'm always going to keep them in the manageable range, but we may need to offset some of that conversion excess testosterone to estrogen. You may need an estrogen blocker. You may have concerns about hair health. Typically, we'll use oral minoxidil to protect hair, right? You may see skin changes. So it's understanding that. I think the beauty of integrating high-level science and understanding of human metabolism, human function, is all about, in my world, how far can I push the human body and how much can I extract, how much performance. I'm 46 years old, right? I want to be able to perform. I've got young kids. You've got young kids, right? I know for a fact I better be performing at least at this level for the next couple of decades, or I'm going to get trucked. I'm going to get run over, right? But the challenge to me is how can we integrate health, science, and optimizing the human body, extracting more and more value, pushing the body. And that's what we look at with supplements. That's what we look at with hormones. That's what we look at across the board. Where are the opportunities to achieve peak performance? That's not for everybody, right? But for those individuals, that's the space I probably love to play in most. All the conversations we have in the OR, it's like, yeah, we can get you, even up to the best, but just understand there's another level beyond it. And that's, to me, is kind of fun. Going back to your question, but like the symptoms of low testosterone, right? So again, number one is energy by far and away. People talk about just being depleted, feeling depleted. Really hard to pin down when you're not sleeping because you got a baby at home and you're working 2 jobs, and hard to know. The decisiveness, the mental clarity. I don't know if you experience it at all, but think of those moments where you've got to make a decision on the fly that affects your business, and it doesn't work to get stuck. It doesn't work to phone a friend. Like, I'm going to get 10 other people, right? As an entrepreneur, you got to make decisions and live with them, right? So that ability to do that, again, these are subtleties. REM sleep, so the quality of sleep, is another big one, right? Do you wake up feeling rested, or do you constantly feel exhausted? Hard to pin down. I've got a 3-year-old at home that loses her mind at 1 a.m., right? Am I waking up exhausted because I was up with her for hours? Hard to pin down, but definitely we know REM sleep to be huge. Here's a fascinating one: mood. Moodiness, mood instability is directly correlated to low levels of testosterone. So people, what do you think of when you hear testosterone supplementation? Roid rage, right? I mean, that's probably one of the most common. And there definitely are those clients that I have, even at low levels of testosterone support, that say they feel more irritable. In general, testosterone is recognized as probably one of the most potent mood stabilizers in the human body, right? So mood is another one that dramatically affects. And then I think the one that probably prompts more visits than anything is libido, right? So there's definitely testosterone.
So low sex drive.
And sex drive. Libido, yeah, exactly. That desire, that motivation to be sexually active. Definitely direct correlate to low testosterone. But then the last piece that I say totally gets overlooked is, call it gym performance, call it muscle maintenance, right? The dad bod, right? We all chalk it up, and there was that whole like trend, like dad bod is in, right? And now it's back to dad bod's out, and all these kinds of things. But that loss of skeletal muscle mass and the direct effect on metabolism, the waistline, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but that progression. So that's kind of that constellation of low T symptoms, but it all has to align with what do the numbers say? What does the data say?
So, but that's why it's important to really go get those numbers tested.
You're wasting your time guessing, and it's wild how many people fill out questionnaires and kind of just dip their toes down this path. The reality is, get your blood tested. My advice to men after the age of 30, unless you're a bump on a log and you live on your mom's couch, if you have a job, if you have stress in your life, I encourage men, at least by the age of 35, to have a comprehensive blood analysis, right?
And you guys do that at Longevity Lab?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's principle to, and the converse to that is, have clients all the time come in and say, hey, do I really need my labs drawn? Yeah, without an objective set of parameters to base our conversation off of, I'm flying blind, totally blind, right? So yeah, your symptoms matter, but what do your symptoms mean? Like I said, all those are so non-specific. I mean, I have brain fog because my 3-year-old comes in at 1 a.m. and screams in my face. She wants a juicy. So like, what do you really expect? But having that objective basis and data to go off of is critical. And like I said, the sad truth of modern Americans, I am shocked day after day after day how many young men are not producing testosterone. Go back to your fertility comment. Guess what? Guess what they're also not producing, right?
Absolutely. Well, man, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
I could sit here and pick your brain about it all day, just because it's something that's going to affect all of us at some point, right? Just don't know when.
Yeah.
To a degree, or it's preventable. I'll say that much.
Yeah. I think my biggest realization, having done, like I said, the crazy diets, the crazy workouts, I've been guilty. Here on the one hand, I'm a physician, I should know better, which I don't know that that's true, but I've been guilty of buying into every trend, doing every fad, trick in the book.
I remember when it was probably like 2 years ago, you were telling me how you'd go to all these steak dinners for work, and you're like, I got it down to where I can eat like half a filet and I'm good.
Yep.
And that's polar opposite.
Yeah.
Than
now
give
me a freaking porterhouse.
To your credit, I love that, man. Like it's completely objective, even regardless, like even if it goes against what you already tried.
Yep.
Which is great.
Right. I'm telling you, I mean, the last thing I'd leave you with is this whole emphasis, the myocentricity, muscle focus of how we strategically and programmatically approach our clients today versus 1 year ago, radically different. Same central problem, totally different approach. I mean, full disclosure, me putting it all out there, I have pounded people with GLPs. And guess what? They lost weight, tons of weight. They were actually very satisfied, very happy. Then when we circle back and start getting into the weeds, though, their energy's in the tank. They're not going to the gym, so on and so forth. I am guilty, I think, of mismanaging and misdirecting efforts towards a number on a piece of metal on the floor versus refocusing and changing the mindset. And by the way, Americans, in general, they want the crash and burn. Americans want to pull through the drive-thru, get a Big Mac, and not get fat. That's the American way, right? It's totally bizarre, unreasonable, ludicrous. And that's what Americans want. Challenging people, and even in the metabolic space, challenging people and saying, hey, we're not going to make it all about rapid weight loss. We're actually, the scale may not budge. And if I see 3 pounds of muscle on your body comp scan, we're going to high five because that's a win long term. That shift in mindset is challenging up front to really get people to buy in. Long-term results, it simplifies everything else. Muscle is the great equalizer.
Absolutely, man.
But I appreciate getting to come on and make this happen.
No, man, it was great to finally have it. And again, I don't know how many 3-minute conversations we've had at the back table about this without ever me being able to ask, like, man, so what is it that Longevity Labs does?
Yeah.
And how was it created?
Right.
And that's something that's really cool about it is that you were the experiment.
Yeah, still am.
Still
am. Like I told someone not too long ago, I said, listen, if I can get paid, a decent wage, keep the lights on, to do all this self-experimentation, go down all the rabbit holes myself, tell you which ones are blind ending, which ones lead to success, all this stuff. That's where the passion and joy has kind of like been restored for me in my profession as a physician. It's like, this is fun. I worked out anyway. I tried to eat healthy anyway. Now I just get paid to do it 1,000 different ways and see what works.
Absolutely.
So,
well, Dr. John Schoeff, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. I'm sure I'll see you here in the next couple of weeks a few times. Yeah, thanks for bringing on. It's called Ketone IQ.
Only online, workhorse energy supplement.
If I dropped an F-bomb in the house when I was a kid, this is what my parents should have washed my mouth out with. It tastes terrible. But I will say,
that's a brilliant idea. Maybe my kids should be exposed.
I would rather do a shot of this will go a lot further than a shot of vodka, right? A shot of whatever. Yeah. It's a little better for you.
Arguably.
Dr. John Schoeff, thank you for coming on, man.
Awesome.
This is Back and Brew.